There is a cave in the south of Spain where the sea wind has been moving in and out for longer than anyone can remember. It carries the smell of salt and limestone and a faint trace of something older, something the wind itself does not understand. The mouth of the cave faces the water. The water is older than nations, older than language, older than the names we have given to our own species. And the cave has been listening to it for 100,000 years. If you were standing there now, on the worn floor where the rock has been smoothed by feet that walked here before farming, before writing, before metal, before the shape of the world we recognize, you would feel something strange in your chest. A weight, a quiet. The kind of quiet that does not come from silence but from absence. As if a room had just been emptied moments before you walked in. As if you had arrived too late to a conversation that lasted 300,000 years. This is where they ended. Not all of them, not in this exact place, but somewhere along this coast, in caves like this one, beneath cliffs eaten away by the Atlantic, in valleys where the firelight flickered for the last time, on faces we will never see, the final members of an entire kind of human disappeared from the world. Not in a single day, not in some dramatic catastrophe. They simply faded, generation by generation, hearth by hearth, until one night, somewhere, a fire went out and no one rekindled it. We call them Neanderthals. We say the word so often and so casually that it has lost its weight. Schoolchildren laugh at the name. Cartoonists draw them hunched, grunting, slow. For more than a century, we treated them like a punchline, like a cautionary tale, like a failed prototype of ourselves. We did not understand what we were looking at. We did not understand that we were looking at a mirror. Because the truth, when it finally arrived, was almost unbearable. The truth was that they were not a failure. They were not stupid. They were not less than us. They were us. Or near enough to us that the word us begins to tremble when you try to draw a line between them and ourselves. They buried their dead. They cared for their wounded. They made tools so refined that modern hands struggle to replicate them. They painted. They listened. They mourned. They loved, in whatever shape love takes when it is happening inside a body that has been shaped by 400,000 winters. And then they were gone. Tonight, I want to take you back. Not to a textbook, not to a museum case full of yellowed bones behind glass. I want to take you back to the world as they knew it, the world before us, the world they walked through every day until one day they did not. I want to take you into the long, slow disappearance of an entire branch of humanity, and I want you to feel it the way they felt it, in fragments, in moments, in firelight, in the cold breath that came in through the cave mouth before dawn. This is the story of the last Neanderthals, the last keepers of a fire that had been burning since before our kind walked out of Africa, the last witnesses to a world that no longer exists, the last echo of a way of being human that the planet will never see again. Listen, the wind is still moving in and out of the cave. The story begins in the cold. Picture a continent without borders, no roads, no farmland, no fences, no villages, no light at night except the moon and the stars and, very rarely, in some distant valley, the orange flicker of a single small fire. This is Europe, but not a Europe you would recognize. The rivers run wider, the forests are deeper, the plains stretch unbroken from the Atlantic coast to the Russian steppe. And across those plains move herds of animals so large they shake the ground when they walk. Mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, giant deer with antlers that span the width of a small house, cave lions whose skulls are larger than any modern predator you can name, cave bears that stand taller than a man on their hind legs and that, in the depths of winter, sleep in the same caves where the people sleep, separated only by darkness and a careful silence. This is the world the Neanderthals were born into. They did not arrive here, they became here. Their species took shape in this landscape over hundreds of thousands of years, slowly, the way a stone is shaped by a river. The cold made them. The cold gave them their broad chests and short, powerful limbs. The cold thickened their bones. The cold widened their noses to warm the air before it reached their lungs. The cold pressed their bodies into a form built for endurance, for strength, for the long, slow work of staying alive in a place that did not particularly want them to. And yet, they thrived. For nearly 400,000 years, they thrived. Think about that number for a moment. 400,000 years. Modern humans, in our current form, have existed for perhaps 300,000. We have built every city, every empire, every cathedral, every language, every poem, every machine, every memory, in less time than the Neanderthals spent simply being themselves. They lasted longer than we have lasted so far. They were not a footnote in human history. They were a chapter as long as our own, maybe longer. And yet, they are gone. To understand how they lived, you have to understand the rhythm of their world. It was not a quiet world. The wind came down from the great ice sheets in the north, sometimes for weeks at a time, carrying snow that did not melt for months, sometimes for years. The seasons were sharper, crueler, more absolute. Summer was a brief, golden mercy that arrived late and left early. Winter was a long siege. The light itself was different. In the depths of the cold seasons, the sun would rise late and set early, dragging itself low across the sky, never quite climbing high enough to warm anything properly. The shadows stretched long across the snow. The breath of every living thing turned to mist and hung in the air like a ghost. This is what they woke to, day after day, generation after generation. And yet, somehow, they made it beautiful. Imagine a family. Not a family the way we think of family today, with neat lines on a paper, with last names and birth certificates. A different kind of family. Maybe a dozen people, maybe 20. Old ones and young ones. A grandmother whose eyes have seen 60 winters, which is an extraordinary lifetime for her people. Almost a kind of magic. Children small enough to fit inside the curve of an adult's arm. Hunters with hands so scarred that the lines of their old wounds look like a second set of fingerprints. A young man who limps from an injury he took years ago in a hunt that should have killed him but did not because his uncle pulled him out of the way of the bull's horn at the last possible second. Now the uncle is dead, and the young man limps, and every step is a kind of memory. They sleep in a cave, not because they have to, not because they cannot build other shelters, but because this particular cave is theirs. Their grandparents slept here. Their grandparents' grandparents slept here. The walls have been blackened by fire for so long that the soot has soaked into the stone itself. The floor is a careful mosaic of bones and ashes and stone tools, swept aside in the corners, stacked in patterns that mean something to the people who made them, and nothing to anyone who comes after. There is an order here, a logic, a home. In the back of the cave, where the daylight does not quite reach, a child is sleeping. Her name, if she has one in any sense we would recognize, is something her mother says softly when no one else is around to hear it. She is wrapped in fur. Her breath is slow. She is dreaming. We do not know what Neanderthal children dreamed about. We will never know. But she is dreaming, and her mother is sitting near the fire watching her, and the firelight is moving across the cave wall, and somewhere out in the snow, a wolf is calling to another wolf, and the world is exactly as it has been for 10,000 years. This is the kind of moment we have to imagine, because no one wrote it down. There were no words on stone tablets, no scrolls, no ledgers. There were only lives. Lives lived completely, fully, deeply, and then ended, and then forgotten. Except for the bones and the tools and the faint chemical signatures of fires in the dirt. We are working with fragments. We are doing forensics on tenderness. We are trying to reconstruct a love story from the scratch marks on a piece of flint. But the love was there. You can feel it in the evidence. You can feel it in the way they buried their old. You can feel it in the way they kept their wounded alive. You can feel it in the small flowers some of them placed in their graves, the ones we found in the pollen analysis, the ones that were not native to the cave and could only have been brought there on purpose. You can feel it in the way they shaped a stone again and again until it was perfect, knowing that the next stone they shaped would also need to be perfect, because the lives of everyone they cared about depended on it. The world was hard, but they made it bearable. They made it more than bearable. They made it theirs. And then, very slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to change. It is difficult to say exactly when. There was no single moment, no clear line on the calendar. The Neanderthals would not have noticed it for many generations, because the change was the kind of change that does not happen inside a single human life. It happened across hundreds of human lives. It happened in the way a glacier moves, by inches, by feet, by miles, over centuries. The world they had known was beginning, very slowly, to become a different world. And although they did not yet know it, somewhere far to the south, in lands they had never seen, in climates they could not imagine, another kind of human was beginning to move. But before we go to that other human, before we follow the first footprints out of the south, let us stay a little longer with the Neanderthals themselves. Let us stay in their caves. Let us stay by their fires. Because if we are going to understand what was lost, we need to understand what was there. So let us begin again. Let us begin with a single day. A single day, somewhere on the cold green edge of a forest in what we would now call France, 60,000 years ago. The first light comes in slowly. It is a pale, thin light, the color of bone, the color of a candle held behind frosted glass. It seeps into the world rather than arriving in it. There is no sunrise, not really. There is only a gradual lifting of the dark, like a heavy blanket being pulled back, inch by inch. A woman is already awake. She has been awake for some time. She was awake before the first light, in that quiet hour when even the animals do not stir. When the fire has burned down to a soft red glow, and the cave is full of the small sounds of the sleeping, the slow breathing of the children, the occasional shift of an old man on his bed of furs and dry grass, the hush of the wind outside, which has eased in the night and is now barely a whisper against the rock. She is not old, but she is not young. She has lived perhaps 30 winters. By the standards of her people, this is the strong middle of a life. By our standards, she would still seem young. Her hair is dark and thick, and braided back away from her face, secured with a strip of sinew. Her hands are wide and capable. Across the back of her left hand, there is a long, pale scar from a knife that slipped many years ago, in an accident she does not like to talk about. The scar has faded into a kind of map. She looks at it sometimes when she is thinking. She rises carefully. The other people in the cave do not stir. She steps over a sleeping dog, an old dog whose face is graying around the muzzle, a dog that has been with the band since it was a pup, and that no one quite remembers choosing. The dog opens one eye, recognizes her, and closes it again. She moves to the fire and feeds it with a few small pieces of wood that have been drying along the wall for weeks. The flames take the wood gratefully. The light grows. She looks at her children for a moment. There are two of them, a boy of perhaps 8 winters and a girl of perhaps 4. The boy sleeps with his mouth open. The girl sleeps with her hand curled around a small piece of bone she found yesterday in the dirt. A piece of bone she has decided is precious. A piece of bone she will not let anyone take from her, even in sleep. The woman smiles at this. The smile is not for anyone else. It is only for the girl, and it is only for this moment, and it is over almost as soon as it appears. She steps out of the cave. The cold hits her immediately, even though she is wrapped in furs, even though her boots are lined with fur, even though her hood is up and her hands are wrapped. The cold goes straight through everything and finds the small, soft places inside her where the warmth still lives. She gasps. She always gasps, even after 30 winters of this. The cold has not become easier. She has only become more practiced at meeting it. She walks down the slope toward the river. The river is partly frozen, but there is a place she knows where the current keeps it open, where the dark water still runs free between the white edges of ice. She breaks the thin crust of new ice with the end of her spear and dips a leather pouch into the water. The water is so cold, it burns her wrist when it splashes against her skin. She does not flinch. She has done this every morning for a long time. She drinks, she fills the pouch, she turns back toward the cave. And it is here, on the walk back up the slope, in the gray gathering light, that something happens. Nothing dramatic, nothing she will remember in particular. She simply stops. She stops on the slope, and she looks out across the valley. The valley is enormous. It opens out below her, mile upon mile, a long curve of pale grass and dark forest and scattered stands of pine. In the far distance, where the land meets the sky, there is a herd of something. Reindeer, maybe. The herd is so distant it looks like a moving shadow, a river of dark dots flowing slowly across the plain. She watches them for a long time. She is not thinking about anything in particular. She is not planning the hunt. She is not making decisions. She is simply standing there, in the cold, looking out across the world, with the leather pouch heavy and dripping in her hand, and the wind moving the loose ends of her braid against her cheek, and the smell of the river behind her, and her children sleeping warm in the cave above her, and her old dog blinking awake in the firelight, and her people stirring slowly into another day. This is what we have to imagine. This is what no fossil can show us. No tool, no bone, no genetic sequence. We can know that she lived. We can know what she ate in rough outlines. We can know how she died, sometimes, if her bones survived. But we cannot know what she was thinking, on that slope, in that light, on that morning. And yet, she was thinking something. She must have been, because her brain was as large as ours. In fact, in many cases, slightly larger. The cavity that held her thoughts could have held our thoughts too. Whatever she was processing, whatever she was feeling, whatever quiet awareness was passing through her mind as she stood on that slope and watched the distant herd, it was the work of a mind fully capable of all the things our minds can do. Wondering, remembering, grieving, hoping, imagining a future, recalling a past, loving the people she had not seen yet that morning, worrying about the boy with the open mouth and the girl with the bone in her hand. She was a person. It feels strange to have to say that, to have to say it out loud, to have to insist on it after a century of cartoons. But it is the most important thing to understand about the Neanderthals, the thing that everything else flows from. They were people, as fully as you are a person, as fully as the people you love are people. They were not a category. They were not a stage of evolution. They were not a missing link or a sketch or a draft. They were the finished work. They were a complete kind of humanity, with all the inner depth that word can hold. And one day, all of them, every single one, was gone. But not yet. Not on that morning. On that morning, she turns from the valley and walks back up the slope, and the wind catches the smoke from the cave entrance and pulls it sideways across the sky, and her people wake to her footsteps, and the day begins. To live in their world, you had to know it. Not the way a tourist knows a place. Not the way a hiker knows a trail. You had to know it the way a body knows its own pulse. The Neanderthals were, in every meaningful sense, scientists of their environment. Not in lab coats, not with theories scrawled on paper, but in the deepest, most practical, most embodied sense possible. They had spent generations learning, by trial and error and inheritance, exactly how their world worked. They knew which berries killed and which berries healed. They knew which mushrooms were food and which were poison and which were medicine. They knew how to read the tracks of a wolf from the tracks of a wild dog, the prints of a young bear from the prints of an old one. They knew which winds carried snow and which winds carried only the thread of snow. They knew when the salmon would come up the rivers and how to wait for them and where to stand. They knew the rocks. This is one of the most extraordinary things about them and one of the easiest to overlook. They knew the rocks. Not in a vague way, in a deep, expert, almost intimate way. They could look at a piece of stone and know, just by looking, whether it would flake cleanly, whether it would hold an edge, whether it could be shaped into a hand axe, or a scraper, or a spear point. They walked across landscapes that, to us, would look like undifferentiated terrain, and they saw, in the rock outcrops and the riverbeds and the cliff faces, a kind of map of resources. This piece of flint is good. That piece of flint is bad. This piece of chert will work for a small blade, but not a large one. That piece of quartzite will be useful for grinding, but not for cutting. And they shaped these stones with techniques so sophisticated that modern archaeologists, working with all the advantages of training and instruction and high-speed cameras, still find it difficult to reproduce them perfectly. The Levallois technique, the method by which they prepared a core of stone in advance so that a single, perfect, predetermined flake could be struck from it, is one of the great, quiet achievements of the human past. It is a feat of planning, of foresight, of three-dimensional thinking. To do it, you must hold in your mind, before you strike, the shape of the flake you intend to produce. You must see the future inside the present. You must understand the stone the way a sculptor understands marble, the way a musician understands silence, the way a chess player understands the board 4 moves before the move is made. They did this routinely. They taught it to their children. It was as ordinary to them as tying a shoelace is to us. But the tools were only the beginning. The tools were the visible part. Underneath the tools was the knowledge that made the tools possible. And underneath the knowledge was the memory, the accumulated, ancestral, inherited memory of a people who had been doing this for thousands of generations. When a Neanderthal man went out to hunt, he was not going out alone. He was carrying his father with him, and his father's father, and the strangers from far back in the deep ancestral past, whose names had long ago dissolved into the mist of forgotten time, but whose lessons were still being whispered in some unspoken way through the hands of every man who ever shaped a spear. The hunt itself was a kind of art form. It was not the brutish, mindless slaughter that early reconstructions imagined. The Neanderthals were not stupid muscle men chasing animals with sticks. They were strategists. They were ambush specialists. They understood animal behavior in ways that modern hunters, even the most skilled, find astonishing. They knew where the deer would come down to drink, and when, and how to position themselves so that the wind would not betray them. They knew which valley would funnel a panicked herd into a narrow space where they could be killed at close range. They knew how to use the landscape itself as a weapon, driving prey toward cliffs, toward marshes, toward dead ends. And they got close. This is the thing that perhaps unsettles modern people the most about them, when they really understand it. The Neanderthals did not have bows. They did not have arrows. Their spears were thrusting spears, designed for close quarters work, not for throwing across distance. To kill a mammoth or a horse or a wild aurochs, a Neanderthal had to be within arm's length of it. He had to walk right up to a creature that weighed many times what he weighed, that had horns longer than his torso, that could trample him in seconds, and he had to put a wooden spear into its body and hold it there until the animal died. The number of broken bones in Neanderthal skeletons is extraordinary. Anthropologists have compared the injury patterns to those of modern rodeo riders. Crushed ribs, snapped femurs, skulls cracked by hooves, spines twisted by impacts. Almost every adult Neanderthal we have ever recovered shows evidence of serious physical injury, often multiple injuries, often healed and re-injured and healed again. This was the cost of living. This was what it meant to put food on the fire. Every meal had been paid for in blood and in pain, and that price had been paid by someone you loved. And so the hunt was not just a hunt. The hunt was a sacred and terrible thing, a test, a prayer, a risk. Every time the men went out, the women did not know if they would come back. Every time the spears were brought down from where they hung on the cave wall, every single person in the band knew, in some quiet part of themselves, that this could be the day, This could be the day the rope breaks. This could be the day the snow shifts. This could be the day the bull turns the wrong way and the horn finds the wrong space between the ribs. And yet they went, day after day, year after year, for 400,000 years.
This is courage, you understand. This is not the bluster of warriors. This is not the swagger of conquerors. This is the deeper, quieter, harder courage of people who simply have to live, who have no choice, who have children to feed, who have old parents who can no longer hunt, who have a fire that must not be allowed to die. So they pick up the spear, and they kiss the children, and they walk out into the cold. And sometimes they do not come back. When they did not come back, the people in the cave knew. There was no announcement, there was no message. There was simply the long, slow accumulation of waiting, hour by hour, as the light began to fade, and the cooking fire was banked lower for warmth instead of stoked higher for celebration. And the woman who had been a wife that morning understood, without being told, that she was something else now, that she would have to be something else, that the cave was now a place where one person was missing, and would always be missing, and would never come back. And yet, by morning, there would still be water to fetch. By morning, the fire would still need feeding. By morning, the children would still need to be held, and the old grandmother would still need her stories, and the dog would still need to be fed scraps, and the world would continue. And grief would have to learn to walk alongside duty for as long as the body had the strength to carry both. This is who they were. This is the texture of their days. This is the depth of what we are talking about when we say they vanished. Now let us speak of their bodies, because if you are going to picture them, if you are going to bring them to life in your mind, you have to picture them correctly. The popular image, even now, even after a century of corrections, even after every museum on Earth has put up new dioramas and new reconstructions, is still wrong. People still imagine them stooped. People still imagine them as a kind of half-finished sketch of humanity. None of this is true. A Neanderthal man, standing fully upright, would have been short by modern European standards. Perhaps 5 feet 5 inches on average. Perhaps a little less. Some larger, some smaller. But here is the thing. He would have been thick. Not fat, thick. Built like a wrestler. Built like a longshoreman. Built like a man who has lifted heavy things every day of his life. His shoulders would have been broad. His chest would have been a deep barrel. His arms would have been heavily muscled all the way from the shoulder to the wrist. His grip strength, by some estimates, would have been roughly twice that of an average modern man. He could have crushed your hand if he chose to. He could have lifted you off the ground without effort. He could have wrestled a bear to a draw, at least for a few seconds. And yet his face would have been gentle. This is what surprises people when they see the careful new reconstructions made from accurate skull measurements in recent forensic art. The face is not a snarl. The face is not a grimace. The face is the face of a person. The brow is heavy, yes. The nose is large and broad. The cheeks are wide and well padded. The chin is small, sloped back. But the eyes are warm. The mouth is capable of every expression yours is capable of. And when the face smiles, it smiles like anyone's face. There is no menace in it. There is only the same shy, ordinary human warmth that you have seen on the face of your own family, your own friends, your own children. The women were a little shorter, a little less heavy in the bone, but still strong, stronger than the strongest modern women. Their arms could throw a spear hard enough to drive it into the side of a horse, although whether they joined the hunt directly is something we still argue about. Some of them did. We know this because their bones showed the same kind of impact injuries that the men's bones show. Whether it was every woman or some women or only certain women in certain bands, we do not know. But we know that the rigid division between hunter and gatherer that we sometimes imposed on our reconstructions of prehistory
was probably much messier in reality. People did what needed to be done. Bodies worked the way bodies needed to work. The children grew up differently than our children grow up. They reached physical maturity earlier. Their skeletons hardened sooner. They had to. There was no long adolescence. There was no 20-year runway of safety in which to figure out who you were. By the age of 12 or 13, a Neanderthal child was, for most practical purposes, an adult. They were hunting. They were working stone. They were caring for younger siblings. They were part of the survival of the group, fully and irreversibly. This is not to say that childhood did not exist. It did. There was play. We know there was play because we have found the remains of toys, of small objects clearly carved for no practical purpose, of pebbles smoothed and shaped and decorated. And we have found the marks of children's hands in caves, in the ochre, in the dust, the tiny prints of small fingers that touched the wall just to touch it, just because the wall was there, just because the world was a thing to be touched. There was play. There was laughter. There were probably games we will never recover, songs we will never hear, stories we will never read. But play was not a separate world from work. They were the same world. A Neanderthal child playing with stones was, in some sense, already learning to work stone. A Neanderthal child running with the older boys was already learning to run with the hunt. There was no firewall between the world of the child and the world of the adult. Life flowed through them all, in a continuous stream, from the smallest baby in his mother's arms to the oldest grandmother sitting silent by the fire, with the firelight catching the wet shine of her eyes. Their language, we believe, was real. We do not know what it sounded like. We do not know what its grammar was, what its vocabulary contained, how it differed from our own languages, or how it resembled them. But we know they had the anatomy for speech. Their hyoid bone, the small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat that anchors the tongue, is nearly identical to ours. Their inner ears were tuned to the same frequencies as ours, the frequencies of human speech. Their version of a particular gene, the one called FOXP2, the one closely associated with the human capacity for language, was the same as ours. They spoke. Of this we can be reasonably sure. What did they say? What did they tell each other in the long evenings around the fire? What did they whisper to their lovers in the dark? What did they sing? What did they pray? What did they curse? What did they joke about? What did they ask their gods, if they had gods? And what did they tell their children when the children asked the questions that all children ask? The ones about why the sun goes down, about why the snow comes, about why the people we love sometimes leave us and do not come back. We will never know. The words are gone. They are gone forever. The wind has carried them away across 40,000 years. Every word ever spoken in the Neanderthal language is gone, as completely as if it had never been. Whole vocabularies, whole grammars, whole bodies of poetry and song and prayer, all of it, gone. And yet, they spoke. And in their speaking, they must have been the same as us, in some essential way. Because all human speech, in every language that has ever existed, returns to the same handful of fundamental things. We talk about food. We talk about danger. We talk about the people we love. We talk about the people we have lost. We talk about the weather, and the night, and the future, and the past, and what we want, and what we are afraid of, and what we have decided, and what we cannot decide. They talked about these things. They must have. There is no other kind of human language. There is no other way for words to take root and grow. So picture them now. Picture them in the firelight. Picture them with their broad shoulders and their warm faces and their language that we will never hear, and their stories we will never read, and their songs that no instrument can replay. Picture them as a people, whole, complete, real. Picture them not as ancestors, not as evolutionary footnotes, not as the previous version of us. Picture them as themselves, because that is what they were. That is what they always were. And that is what was lost. Now, before we move forward, before we follow the threads of their slow disappearance, we have to spend some time in their inner world, because this is where the deepest misunderstandings have lived. For most of the 20th century, the dominant assumption among scientists was that whatever the Neanderthals were, they were not capable of the things we call symbolic thought. They could not, the argument went, conceive of abstract ideas. They could not represent the world in images. They could not believe in spirits or imagine an afterlife or contemplate their own deaths. They were, the argument concluded, magnificent biological machines, perfectly adapted to a harsh world, but ultimately empty inside. This has turned out to be wrong. Completely, deeply, profoundly wrong. Let me tell you about a cave in Spain, a cave called La Pasiega. Deep inside it, on a wall that has not seen direct sunlight in 100,000 years, there is a series of red lines. They are not random. They are arranged in a deliberate pattern, almost like a ladder. They were painted in ochre, the same ochre that human beings have used for art for as long as art has existed. When researchers dated the calcium carbonate that had formed on top of the painting over the millennia, they discovered something that shook the field. The painting was at least 64,000 years old. And here is the unbearable, beautiful, terrible truth. Modern humans were not in Western Europe 64,000 years ago. Not yet. They had not arrived. The only people in that cave, at that time, who could have lifted the brush and made those marks were Neanderthals. It was a Neanderthal who painted on that wall. Sit with that for a moment. Let it land. A Neanderthal, somewhere in the unreachable depths of the past, walked into a cave with a torch in one hand and a clump of ochre in the other. He or she climbed down into the dark. He or she found a place on the wall where the firelight would catch it. And there, in the silence and the smoke and the breathing of the earth, he or she painted. Not for food, not for warmth, not for any practical purpose. Painted because there was something inside that needed to come out. Painted because the wall was there, and the ochre was there, and the impulse to leave a mark was there. The same impulse that, 100,000 years later, would carve cathedrals out of stone and send rockets to the moon. Painted because they were people. And it does not stop with the cave at La Pasiega. We have found evidence of Neanderthal artistic and symbolic behavior across Europe and the Near East. Eagle talons drilled and strung as jewelry, found in caves where no modern human had yet set foot. Shells pierced and threaded onto necklaces. Feathers, gathered from birds whose colors clearly mattered to the gatherers, used in some form of decoration that has long since rotted away, but whose traces remain in the patterns of cuts on the wing bones. Pigment kits, complete with grinding stones and mixing shells, in places that predate the arrival of our species by thousands of years. They wore ornaments. They decorated themselves. They marked their bodies and their tools and their walls. They made things that had no function except to be beautiful, or to mean something, or to say something that words could not quite say. This is not the behavior of empty machines. This is the behavior of people with inner lives, people with imagination, people who looked at a feather and saw, beyond its physical existence, a kind of meaning, an association, a story. People who looked at a bear's claw and saw, beyond the tool it could become, a symbol, a mark of strength, perhaps a way of carrying the spirit of the animal with you long after the animal was dead. And then there are the burials. This is perhaps the most haunting evidence of all. The Neanderthals buried their dead. Not always, not everywhere, but in many places, in many caves, across many thousands of years, when one of their own died, they did not simply leave the body where it fell. They did not let the scavengers come. They prepared the dead. They dug into the earth or arranged stones, or curled the body into a particular position. They placed objects beside it sometimes, pieces of bone, tools, small stones and colors that may have meant something, flowers in at least one famous case, although the evidence for that has been argued about for decades. They went to the trouble, they took the time, they cared. Why would they care? Why would a creature that is supposedly empty inside, supposedly incapable of abstract thought, bother to bury its dead with any kind of ceremony at all. The dead body is not useful. It cannot feed you. It cannot warm you. It cannot help you survive the winter. From a purely practical perspective, you should walk away from it. You should leave the cave it died in and find a new one. You should let nature do what nature does. But they did not walk away. They stayed. They dug. They arranged. They mourned. This is the unmistakable signature of beings who knew that death was a meaningful event. Beings who understood that the person who had just died was the same person they had laughed with, the same person they had hunted with, the same person whose hand they had held, and that this person was now gone in some way that mattered, and that the body that remained needed to be treated with care, with reverence even. We do not know what they believed about death. We will never know. But we know they cared about it. We know they had ceremonies, or something like ceremonies, or at least gestures that approached ceremonies. We know they did not see the dead as objects. And there is more. There is the long, patient, careful evidence of how they treated the living. There are skeletons of Neanderthal adults who lived for years with injuries so severe that they could not possibly have fed themselves or hunted or even walked without assistance. There is the famous old man from Shanidar Cave in modern-day Iraq, whose skeleton tells the story of a life that should have ended in his 30s. He had a withered right arm, probably from a childhood injury, the arm so damaged it had eventually been amputated below the elbow. He was blind in one eye. He had healed fractures across his face. He had a crushed foot that would have made walking painful at best. By every measure of the harsh world he lived in, he should not have survived past adolescence. But he did. He lived into his 40s. He died old by the standards of his people. For decades he was fed. For decades he was carried when he needed to be carried. For decades he was sheltered, even though he could contribute very little to the practical survival of the band. He was kept alive because someone, or several someones, loved him enough to keep him alive. Wife, sons, daughters, sister, friend. We will never know exactly who, but we know that for nearly half his life, he was utterly dependent on the kindness of others, and that kindness was given to him, again and again, year after year, until he died of natural causes in a cave full of people who had cared for him for as long as anyone could remember. This is who they were. This is what they did for each other. A creature that takes care of its broken members for decades is not a creature without empathy. It is a creature with one of the deepest forms of empathy that exists. It is a creature that has chosen, against the practical logic of survival, to value the inner life of its kin more than the outer logic of efficiency. It is a creature that loves, and love, in the end, is what made them human. Whatever else we want to argue about, whatever else we want to debate about their bodies or their tools or their language or their art, the love is not in question. The love is on the bones. It is written into the skeletons. It is in the survival of the wounded, the burial of the dead, the gathered flowers, the carved feathers, the painted walls. The love is the thing we cannot deny. The Neanderthals loved each other. For 400,000 years, they loved each other. And then, somewhere, in some cold cave on some forgotten hillside, the last of them loved the last of them. And after that, there was no one left to love them back. We have to talk about time now. About the strange, slippery, almost incomprehensible scale of time we are dealing with. Because one of the things that makes the Neanderthals so difficult to understand is that they did not happen quickly. They did not appear in some dramatic moment, flourish for a brief period, and then vanish in a cinematic catastrophe. They happened slowly. So slowly that, on the timescale of a single human life, nothing about their existence would have seemed to be changing. They were, for hundreds of thousands of years, simply there. The way mountains are there. The way oceans are there. The way the moon is there. Imagine that you could collapse the entire span of Neanderthal existence into a single calendar year. Begin it on January 1st. The first recognizable Neanderthals appear in this compressed time on January 1st. They are the result of a long evolution from an earlier kind of human, a process that began even earlier, off the calendar entirely, in some prior age we will not try to map here. So January 1st arrives, and the Neanderthals are walking the earth. Now let the year unfold. Let the seasons pass. Let the days tick by. Spring comes. Summer comes. The Neanderthals are still there. Autumn comes. They are still there. Winter comes. They are still there. December arrives. Christmas arrives. New Year's Eve arrives. They are still there. And then, in the last few hours of December 31st, the very last hours of this compressed year, they begin to disappear. By midnight, they are gone. That is the scale we are talking about. A people who existed for so long that, if you compress their entire history into a single year, modern humans only show up in Europe to meet them around mid-December, and the entire process of their decline happens in less than 2 weeks of compressed time. And here is the thing. From inside their world, none of this would have been visible. No Neanderthal woman fetching water in the morning would have known that her people had been there for 400,000 years. She would have known the stories her grandmother told her. She would have known the songs that had been passed down. She would have known, perhaps, of a few generations before her, the great names, the great hunts, the great winters. But she would not have known the depth of her own past. She would not have known the antiquity of her people. To her people were simply the people. They had always been there. They would always be there. That was the world. This is, in a way, one of the most heartbreaking aspects of their story. They did not know what they were. They did not know how long they had endured. They did not know how rare and precious and singular their kind of humanity was. They simply lived, the way you and I simply live. Each day for what it was, each season for what it was. Each generation passing into the next without any sense of the great wheel turning slowly behind them. And the wheel was turning. Slowly. Surely. The climate that had birthed them was beginning, in ways no one could see, to shift. The world they had perfectly adapted to was beginning, by tiny increments, to become a different world. The climate of the European Pleistocene was not a single, cold thing. It was an unstable thing. It oscillated. The ice sheets advanced and retreated. Forests grew and shrank. The herds of mammoth and reindeer migrated north and south as the temperature allowed. For most of Neanderthal history, these oscillations were within a range that they could handle. They had been shaped by exactly these conditions. They knew how to ride out the cold snaps. They knew how to take advantage of the warm interludes. Their bodies, their tools, their knowledge, all of it had been calibrated, generation by generation, to a very particular kind of unstable world. But around 60,000 years ago, and then again around 45,000 years ago, the oscillations began to get sharper. The swings between cold and warm became faster. The familiar patterns began to dissolve. Herds moved in ways they had not moved before. Forests appeared in places forests had not been. Snow came at the wrong times of year, or did not come when it was expected, or came in volumes that exceeded what anyone could remember. To a Neanderthal hunter who had spent his whole life learning to read the land, this would have been disorienting. Not catastrophic, not yet, but unsettling. The old men would have shaken their heads. The old women would have said it had never been like this in their mother's time. The young men would have laughed and said the old people always say that. But underneath the laughter, there would have been a quiet, growing sense that something was different, that the rules were changing, that the world they had been promised by their elders was not quite the world that was now arriving. This is how an extinction begins, not with a sudden blow, with a slow uncertainty, a drift, a growing wrongness in the air that no single person can quite name. And then, around 45,000 years ago, perhaps a little earlier in some places and a little later in others, the strangers began to arrive. They came from the south, from the warm lands the Neanderthals had never visited, the lands of dry plains and great rivers, the lands where their own ancestors had never set foot. They came in small groups, they came slowly, they came following the herds or perhaps following something else, some restless inner drive that has never quite left our kind, the drive that pushes us, again and again, to walk over the next hill, to see what is past the next bend in the river, to find out what lies beyond the horizon. They were tall. That would have been the first thing anyone noticed. They were taller than the Neanderthals. Their limbs were longer. Their faces were different. Their voices, when they spoke, did not sound like the speech of the people in the caves. Their tools were different. Their clothes were different. The way they walked across the land was different. These were our ancestors, the first modern humans to enter Europe. Our great many times great-grandparents, the opening edge of the wave that, in time, would become every European, every Asian, every American, every human being who has ever lived outside of Africa. They were us, in our earliest unfolding form, and they were walking, slowly and steadily, into a land that had belonged to someone else for hundreds of thousands of years. This is the moment around which the whole story turns. This is the meeting that should have been impossible. Two different kinds of human, both descended from a common ancestor far back in the deep past of Africa, both shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of separate evolution, now standing on the same ground, looking at each other across the cold air, trying to understand what they were seeing. There is no record of the first meeting. There could not be. There was no one there to write it down. But we can imagine it. We can imagine a small hunting party of modern humans coming up over a ridge in what is now Eastern Europe, seeing in the distance the smoke from a Neanderthal fire. We can imagine the Neanderthals seeing the strangers approach from the south, watching them carefully, weighing them as they would weigh any new thing in the land. We can imagine the moment when they came close enough to look at each other, to really look, face to face, eye to eye. What did they see? Did they recognize each other as people? Or did they see, in each other, something foreign, something other, something not quite human? This is one of the great questions, and we may never fully answer it. But here is one piece of evidence. Almost every modern person who lives outside of Africa carries Neanderthal DNA. Roughly 1 to 4% of the genome of every non-African human alive today comes from Neanderthal ancestors. This is not a small number. This is a substantial inheritance, and it means unambiguously that the two kinds of human did not merely meet, they mated. They had children. Those children grew up. They had children of their own. The bloodlines did not stay separate. They merged. So whatever else happened, whatever conflicts there were, whatever fears, whatever misunderstandings, somewhere, again and again, in caves and beside rivers, and in the long, quiet evenings of 100,000 forgotten years, a Neanderthal and a modern human looked at each other and saw not an enemy, not a creature, not a monster, but another person. And from that recognition came love, or something close enough to love, that the result was a child. And the child grew up, and the child was both. And the child had her own children, and those children went on, and their children went on. And now, all these tens of thousands of years later, that ancient encounter is still inside us. It is in your blood. It is in your bones. The gene that allowed your skin to thicken against the cold of the European winter may have come from them. The gene that helps your immune system recognize certain ancient viruses may have come from them. The gene that gives some people red hair. The gene that gives some people freckles. The genes that shape certain parts of certain people's brains, certain people's joints, certain people's metabolisms. All of these may carry whispers of Neanderthal ancestry. They did not vanish completely. Not really. They went into us. They are walking around right now, inside our cells, every time you breathe, every time your heart beats, every time you laugh, every time you cry. A part of them is still here. But the people themselves, the people in the caves, the people with the broad shoulders and the warm faces and the language we will never hear, the people who buried their dead and painted the walls and loved the broken old man for decades, Those people are gone. The bloodline survives in fragments. The species does not. How did it happen? How could it have happened? How could a people who had survived 400,000 years of ice and famine and disaster, who had built a culture and a language and a way of being human that worked across every European landscape, who had outlasted 10 different kinds of catastrophe, simply fade in a few thousand years after the strangers arrived? The answer is complicated. There is no single villain. There is no single moment. There is, instead, a slow tightening, a net of small forces, none of them catastrophic on their own, all of them combining over centuries into a pressure that, in the end, the Neanderthals could not absorb.
Let us walk through it. Carefully. Honestly. Without melodrama. Because their ending was not the sort of thing that lends itself to easy stories. It was the kind of ending that happens in real life. Slow. Sad. Quiet. Made of 1,000 small losses, none of which seemed final at the time. The first pressure was the climate itself. The unstable swings of temperature that had been disorienting the old ways of the Neanderthals were not getting better. They were getting worse. Through the period when modern humans were entering Europe, the climate became increasingly volatile. There were brief warm phases when forests expanded and game shifted, and then sudden cold snaps that drove the forest back and forced everyone to adapt all over again. For people whose entire culture had been built on a deep, careful, multi-generational reading of a particular set of conditions, this constant change was exhausting. The old knowledge was no longer reliable. The old hunting grounds were no longer producing. The old migration patterns of the herds were breaking down. It is not that the Neanderthals could not adapt. They could. They had always adapted. They had been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years. But adaptation has a cost. Every generation that has to relearn the rules of its environment loses something. Every band that has to move to new territory loses the deep memory of the old territory, the accumulated wisdom of the people, the slow inheritance of knowing exactly which valley produced the best stone for blades, exactly which slope produced the best berries in the late summer, exactly which river would freeze in which order as winter came on. All of this began to erode. And there was a second pressure, harder to see, but perhaps even more important. The Neanderthals lived in small bands, small networks. Their groups were tight, close-knit, deeply bonded. But the networks did not extend very far. A Neanderthal band might know its neighbors over a range of perhaps 50 miles, perhaps 100. Beyond that, the world was unknown. Tools and materials in their archaeological sites tend to be local. They used the stone that was within walking distance. They hunted the herds that came through their valley. Their world was deep, but it was also small. The newcomers, the modern humans, lived differently. Their networks were much larger, their tools traveled, their decorations, their pigments, their shells, their stone materials all moved across enormous distances. A modern human band in Central Europe might have access through chains of exchange and trade to materials from hundreds of miles away, to the Atlantic coast, to the Mediterranean, to the great mountains and the great rivers. They lived in a world that was, in some quiet but transformative way, much larger than the world of the Neanderthals. This mattered enormously, because when the climate began to shift and the local environment became unreliable, the modern humans had backup. If the herds did not come through this year, they had cousins 3 valleys over who could spare some food. If a particular kind of stone was no longer available, they could trade for it. If a child was orphaned or a hunter was crippled, the larger network could absorb the loss. The Neanderthals could not. Their bands were islands. Each one was, in some sense, alone. When a Neanderthal band ran into a hard year, it had to survive on its own. There was no backup. There was no relief. If too many hunters were lost in a bad winter, if too many children died in a season of disease, if too many old people were taken by a bad spring, there was no one to step in and refill the empty places. The math of small numbers is brutal. We know this from modern conservation biology.
A species of animal can have many thousands of individuals in the world and still be on the path to extinction if those individuals are scattered into too many small groups, each isolated, each genetically thinning, each vulnerable to a single bad year. The Neanderthals, in their last few millennia, may have looked like a sustainable population in raw numbers, but the structure of their society, the small band, low-network nature of their world, made them deeply fragile. Every bad year took something irrecoverable, and the bad years were becoming more frequent. A third pressure was direct competition. Not war, not necessarily. There is some evidence of violence between the two kinds of human, but there is not, so far, conclusive evidence of organized warfare. The Neanderthals did not go down in some great battle. They did not fall in a glorious last stand. What seems to have happened instead is something much quieter and much sadder. The modern humans were efficient, not necessarily smarter in any deep cognitive sense, but more efficient. They had better long-distance weapons. They had bows and arrows eventually, and atlatls, the spear throwers that doubled the range of a hunting cast. They could kill animals from a distance without having to engage in the close-quarters wrestling matches that the Neanderthals had refined over hundreds of thousands of years. This meant fewer injuries, fewer deaths in the hunt, more food per unit of risk. It also meant that the modern humans were taking the same animals that the Neanderthals were taking, the same reindeer, the same horses, the same aurochs. There were not infinite herds in Europe. There was a finite biomass of game, distributed unevenly across the landscape, and now there were two kinds of human hunting it. Two kinds of human with different methods, different ranges, different rates of success. Every animal taken by a modern human was an animal that would not be available to a Neanderthal. Over generations, this added up. The Neanderthals, locked into their close-quarters hunting strategies, slowly began to find that the herds were thinner, that the hunts were harder, that the lean years were leaner. They could see it. They must have been able to see it. The old men in the caves would have noticed year by year that the meat was less reliable, that the children were a little hungrier in the spring, that the tools needed to be repaired more often because the new hunting grounds were on harder ground. They would have noticed without understanding why. They would have blamed the gods. They would have blamed bad luck. They would have blamed themselves. They would not, perhaps, have understood that there was another kind of human, 3 valleys over, taking the deer they were no longer finding. And there was a fourth pressure, and this one is the strangest and the most modern in its implications. There was disease. When two long-separated populations of humans meet, they share microbes. The microbes that have been circulating in one population have been co-evolving with that population for tens of thousands of years. The bodies of that population have adapted to those microbes. They have built up the right antibodies. They have inherited the right immune responses. The diseases that come along with that population may seem mild to its members or even unnoticeable because everyone has been exposed since childhood. But when those microbes are introduced into a new population, a population that has never encountered them, a population without the inherited defenses, the consequences can be catastrophic. We have seen this, in modern history, more times than we want to remember. When European explorers and colonists arrived in the Americas, the diseases they carried, smallpox and measles and influenza and others, devastated indigenous populations who had no prior exposure. In some places, the death rates were 90% or higher. Entire civilizations were emptied within decades, not by armies, by microbes. There is now serious scientific argument that something similar may have happened in slow motion when modern humans entered Europe. The modern humans had been living for hundreds of thousands of years in different climates, with different parasites, different bacteria, different viruses. Their bodies had adapted. Their immune systems were ready. When they arrived in Neanderthal territory, they brought their microbial baggage with them. And the Neanderthals, who had never encountered these specific pathogens, who had no inherited defenses, may have been hit hard. We cannot prove this. We may never be able to prove it definitively. The microbes themselves do not fossilize in any direct way. But the pattern is suggestive, and it would help to explain why a people who had survived for hundreds of thousands of years, in some of the harshest conditions any human population has ever endured, could fade away so quickly once the strangers from the south began to share their bands and their caves, and sometimes their beds. So here is the picture. The climate is shifting, the herds are thinning, the new humans are spreading, the diseases are arriving, the networks are too small, the bands are too isolated, the losses are accumulating. Every winter takes a little more than it gives. Every generation is a little smaller than the one before it. The old people die, and there is no one to replace their knowledge. The young men go out to hunt, and fewer of them come back, and the ones who do come back with less meat than their fathers used to bring home. Slowly, almost invisibly, the great wheel begins to turn. It does not turn quickly, it does not turn all at once, but it turns. And once it begins to turn, in the direction of decline, it is very, very hard to make it turn back. This is how a people ends, not in fire, not in war, not in some final desperate battle on a hilltop somewhere. Just like this, in long, quiet centuries of just slightly too little, of just slightly too few, of just slightly too many small heartbreaks, and just slightly too little reserve to absorb them. Until one day, in some unmarked place, in some unremembered season, the last child of an entire kind of human is born, and grows up, and lives a life, and dies alone, and there is no one left to bury her. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We are watching the end, before we have fully lived through the long, slow middle. So let us slow down. Let us pull back. Let us go back to a moment that must have happened many times in many places before the decline took hold. Let us go back to the first encounters. There would have been many of them, not one moment, many, across thousands of miles, across thousands of years. In the Levant first, perhaps, in the warm corridors that lead out of Africa into the Near East, where the two kinds of human had probably already met and parted and met again, off and on, for as long as 100,000 years before the great wave that swept into Europe. And then later, further north, further west, in places where the Neanderthals had been the only humankind for so long that the very idea of another human, another people, would have been incomprehensible to them. Imagine a band of Neanderthals in a valley somewhere in what is now Romania. The year is roughly 45,000 years ago. The valley is wide and green in summer, with a river running through it that they have used for generations. They know every bend of the river. They know which boulders to crouch behind when the deer come down to drink. They know which slopes are safe in the spring melt, and which slopes will send a sudden rush of mud and stone down upon anyone caught beneath them. The valley is their home. It has been their home for as long as anyone can remember. One day, a young man comes back from a hunting trip with strange news. He has seen, on the far side of the valley, footprints. Footprints that are not his people's footprints. Not the prints of a bear, not the prints of any animal he knows. Prints that look almost like a Neanderthal's prints, but not quite. Narrower, longer, made by a foot that is shaped slightly differently. The old hunters listen. They go to look. They see the prints. They follow them, carefully, for some distance, until the prints disappear into a patch of rocky ground where no track can be read. They stand there for a long time, looking at where the prints went, looking around at the valley, looking at the place where somehow a foot that was not their foot had pressed into the earth and then walked away. They do not know what to make of it. In the weeks that follow, there are more signs. A campfire on a ridge, gone cold by the time anyone investigates, but with the careful arrangement of stones that suggests deliberate making. A bone, recently butchered, but butchered with cuts that are not their cuts, the angles wrong, the technique strange. A scraping mark on a tree trunk that no one can identify. The old men begin to talk. The old women begin to listen. There are stories, very old stories, almost too old to remember, about other peoples. About strangers from the south. About a kind of human that had once come and gone long before any of them were born. The grandmothers tell the stories to the children's eyes go wide, the firelight catches in the wet shine of their attention. The stories say that the strangers are dangerous. The stories say that the strangers are different. The stories say to be careful. And then, one autumn day, when the leaves are turning and the air has begun to bite again with the promise of the coming cold, the strangers appear. There are about a dozen of them. They walk together in a loose, watchful formation. They are armed with long, slender spears. They have packs on their backs. The men are tall, taller than any Neanderthal. Their faces are leaner. Their movements are different. They walk in a way that is faster, lighter, less deliberate. They speak among themselves in a language that has none of the same sounds. The Neanderthals see them from the ridge. The hunters crouch low in the grass. The old man holds up a hand, asking for silence. The strangers walk along the riverbank below, looking up, looking around, clearly aware that this is someone else's land. They have seen the smoke from the cave. They have seen the trails. They know they are not alone here. What happens next? We do not know. There is no record. But based on the pattern of evidence across thousands of similar moments scattered across the archaeological record, the most likely answer is this. The two groups looked at each other. They watched each other. They tested each other. And then, in most cases, they moved on. The Neanderthals were not stupid. They knew when to fight and when to step back. The strangers, similarly, were not stupid. They were a small band in unfamiliar country. They had no interest in a confrontation they might lose. So in most cases, the first encounter would have ended without violence. It would have ended with the two groups passing each other carefully, like two herds of animals who recognize each other as something to be respected, but not necessarily attacked. The Neanderthals would have returned to the cave. The strangers would have moved on down the river. By nightfall, the children would have been told that something had been seen, but that everyone was safe, and that the world was still the world. But the world was not still the world. Something had changed, and they did not know it yet. The strangers had been here. The strangers would be back. And in the long years to come, the strangers would not just pass through. In some places, in some valleys, in some seasons, the encounters would have gone differently. There would have been moments of curiosity, of trade perhaps, of cautious approach. A modern human band, learning that there were Neanderthals living in a nearby cave, might have approached with gifts. A piece of polished bone perhaps, a handful of pretty shells, some food in a leather pouch. The Neanderthals, in turn, might have offered something back. A piece of flint perhaps, from their own quarry, a bit of hide. And from these tentative exchanges, slowly, a relationship of sorts might have developed. Not in every place, not for every band, but in enough places, often enough, that the patterns we now see in the DNA of every non-African human alive today could form. There would have been days when a young Neanderthal man, hunting alone in a valley, encountered a young modern human woman, also alone, gathering berries near a stream. There would have been a moment of frozen surprise. There would have been a long, quiet looking. And then, perhaps, instead of running, instead of attacking, instead of calling out to the others, the two of them would have simply stood there, looking at each other across the cold air. Two different kinds of human, two different stories, two different lives, recognizing in each other something that was not entirely foreign, something that was, in fact, very close to themselves. We do not know if they spoke. We do not know if they understood each other's words. But there are other ways to communicate. There are smiles. There are gestures. There are the small, soft movements of a hand reaching out, very slowly, very carefully, to see if the hand will be taken. Sometimes the hand was taken. We know this because we are here. Every person with non-African ancestry alive on this planet today is the descendant of one of those moments, of one of those quiet encounters in a forgotten valley, of one of those impossible meetings between two different kinds of human who found, against every reason to fear each other, that they could love each other instead, or that they could, at the very least, share something close enough to love that a child was the result. And the child was raised, by one side or the other, perhaps by both. And the child grew, and learned to speak whatever language was around them, and learned to hunt, or to gather, or to weave, or to shape stone, and lived a life, and died, and left children of their own. Somewhere in your family tree, very far back, there is a Neanderthal grandmother, or a Neanderthal grandfather, maybe many of them, scattered across the deep generations, contributing small fragments of themselves to the great river of inheritance that eventually became you. They are part of you now. They will always be part of you. Every time you flex a hand, or feel a chill, or fight off a virus, there is, in some small, invisible way, an echo of them inside the cells doing the work. But that is the genetic story. That is the story of the bloodline. The story of the people, the actual people, the ones who lived in the caves and made the tools and walked the valleys, is a different story. And it is, in the end, a sadder one. Because for every quiet meeting that ended in a shared meal, or a shared night, or a shared child, there were probably many that ended in suspicion, in fear, in conflict. And even in the meetings that ended well, there was a slow, steady, unstoppable process at work. The Neanderthals were the smaller population. The modern humans, over the long arc of centuries, were the larger and faster-growing one. And so, generation by generation, the children of mixed parentage tended to be raised in the larger, more connected, more numerous community. The cultural inheritance flowed in one direction. The Neanderthal way of being, the Neanderthal language, the Neanderthal stories, the Neanderthal songs, the Neanderthal art, all of this was, slowly, being absorbed and then forgotten. It is one of the quiet tragedies of their disappearance. They did not vanish without leaving descendants. They left descendants. But their descendants did not remain Neanderthals. Their descendants became part of us. And in becoming part of us, the specific shape of who they had been, the specific texture of their inner world, the specific resonance of their voices in the firelight, was lost. A people can disappear into another people. They can be absorbed. And the result, for the absorbing population, can be enrichment, new genes, new strengths, new traits. But for the absorbed population, what happens is something close to a kind of death. The bloodline survives, but the culture does not. The body persists in fragmented form, but the soul of the people, if we can use such a word, is dissolved. This is what happened to the Neanderthals in part. Not entirely, but in part. And in part also, they simply died. Generation by generation, in caves across Europe, the small bands grew smaller. The births did not keep up with the deaths. The old people, who had once been a treasured resource of knowledge, became, in some cases, an unbearable burden because there were not enough young hunters to feed them. The traditions began to falter. The stones began to be worked less skillfully because the master teachers had died and there was no one left to learn from them. The hunting techniques began to simplify. The art began to fade. There are sites in the late Neanderthal period where the archaeological record shows what looks like a kind of cultural exhaustion. The tools are still being made, but they are not as refined as they once were. The hearths are still being lit, but they are smaller. The bands are still moving across the landscape, but their movements are smaller, more confined, more local. It is as if a great civilization, in slow motion, had begun to forget itself. Not because the people inside it were stupid, not because they had lost their humanity, but because there were simply fewer of them, and the small numbers could no longer sustain the depth and the richness that a larger population had once supported. You cannot maintain a complex culture with too few people. You cannot maintain a complex language with too few speakers. You cannot maintain a complex craft with too few practitioners. The world the Neanderthals had built, the world of careful tool-making and careful hunting and careful burial and careful art, depended on a certain critical mass of people to sustain it. And as the critical mass eroded, the world began to thin out. The way a fire begins to thin out when the fuel runs low. The way a song begins to thin out when too few voices are singing it. By 35,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were already largely gone from much of Europe. There were holdouts, pockets, refugia, bands clinging to the edges of the world, in the south, in the warmer corners, in places where the land still produced enough to support a small population. But across the great central plains of Europe, where they had once been the only people, they were vanishing. Caves that had been occupied for tens of thousands of years went silent. The fires went out. The footprints on the cave floors were no longer renewed. And the strangers, the modern humans, kept arriving, kept spreading, kept growing. They were not coming to conquer, not in any sense we would recognize. They were not running an invasion. They were simply living, hunting, having children, moving when the herds moved, making art, making love, burying their own dead, doing what people do. But their living was, by its very nature, a slow displacement of the people who had been there before. Not because they wanted to displace anyone, not because they hated the Neanderthals or wished them gone, but because the world is a finite thing, and when two peoples occupy the same finite world, the one that is growing will, over time, come to fill the spaces that the one that is shrinking is leaving behind. This is not a moral story. This is not a story of good guys and bad guys. It is, in a way, a much harder story than that. It is the story of two kinds of human beings, both with their gifts, both with their failings, both worthy in every way of being called people. And one of them, through no particular evil and no particular fault, simply fading. The way mist fades when the sun comes up. The way a fire fades when the wood runs low. The way a song fades when the singer falls silent. They were not killed. They were not defeated. They were not exterminated. They were just, somehow, no longer here. And the strangest, hardest part of all of this is that for a long time, nobody noticed. The world simply continued. The strangers became the people. Their descendants spread. Their children's children's children filled Europe, and then Asia, and then the rest of the world. The story of humanity, as we now tell it, became the story of modern humans, with the Neanderthals reduced to a footnote, a curiosity, a name in a book. But they had been a whole world. They had been a whole way of being human. They had been 400,000 years of love and grief and art and survival and tenderness and joy. And all of it disappeared into the noise of our own becoming. And for tens of thousands of years, no one remembered them at all. It was not until the 19th century that anyone began to suspect they had existed. A skull was found in a quarry in the Neander Valley in Germany in 1856. The workers thought it was a cave bear at first. Then they thought it might be a deformed modern human. It took years before anyone realized that what they were looking at was something else entirely, the remains of another kind of person, a relative, a cousin, someone who had walked the earth in the unfathomable distance of the deep past and who had been entirely forgotten until that moment in the quarry when a worker's pick struck bone and the long silence of 40,000 years began, very slowly, to break. Since then, we have learned a great deal. We have found more skeletons, we have found tools, we have found hearths and burials and paintings. We have sequenced their DNA. We have, in the past 2 decades, learned more about them than was known in the entire previous history of the field. And every new discovery has, in some way, brought them closer to us, has made them less strange, has made them more recognizable, has made it harder, not easier, to maintain the comforting distance that the early reconstructions tried to establish. They are not aliens. They are not monsters. They are not failed prototypes. They are us. Or near enough to us that the difference, in the end, may not be the kind of difference that matters very much. And they are gone. Let us go now to one of the last places where they lived. Let us go to the very edge of their existence. Let us go to the Rock of Gibraltar. Gibraltar is a place where the world feels like it is ending and beginning at the same time. The great limestone outcrop rises out of the sea, gray and gold and white in the changing light, with the Atlantic Ocean on one side and the Mediterranean on the other, and the coast of Africa visible across the strait on a clear day. It is a place where continents meet, a place where waters meet, a place where, at the very end of the long story of the Neanderthals, two worlds came together for the last time. Inside the rock, there are caves, many caves. Some of them have been known and explored for a long time. Others have only been discovered in recent decades. The most famous of them is called Gorham's Cave. It is a wide, vaulted opening that looks out onto the Mediterranean. Standing inside it, you can hear the waves. You can smell the salt. The light comes in across the water, slanting blue and gold, and the cave walls glow softly in the reflected sun. 28,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years, this cave was a home. We know this because the floor is layered, like a book, with the evidence of long occupation. Hearths, tools, animal bones, shells, ash. And the tools, in the upper layers, are unmistakably Neanderthal. They were made by Neanderthals, in the Mousterian style that had been their signature for hundreds of thousands of years. These were the last Neanderthals. Not the only last ones. There were others in other refugia, in other corners of southern Europe and the Caucasus, and perhaps further east. But these, the ones at Gorham's Cave, may have been among the very last. The dating is contested, the exact chronology has been argued about for years, but the broad picture is clear. In this cave, on this rock, at the southern edge of Europe, with the sea spread out before them and the cliffs rising above them, a small band of Neanderthals lived and hunted and gathered and slept and ate and dreamed for many thousands of years longer than their kin in most of the rest of Europe had survived. They were the holdouts. They were the keepers of the old flame. Imagine standing on the cliff above the cave, looking out at the sea. The water is dark blue, almost purple in the late afternoon. The wind is up, but it is a warmer wind than the wind that had once moved across the Central European plains. This is the south. This is the edge. There are no glaciers visible. There are no mammoths. The world here is gentler. The forests come down close to the water. The rabbits run in the underbrush. The seabirds wheel above the rocks. These last Neanderthals had adapted. They had learned to live in this softer landscape. They were fishing. They were gathering shellfish from the rocks at low tide. They were hunting smaller game, deer and boar and rabbit, in the patches of forest and scrubland along the coast. They had let go of some of the old ways. The mammoth hunts were a memory from the deep past. The reindeer were long gone from these latitudes. The world had changed, and they had changed with it. But they were few, so few, perhaps only a few hundred individuals scattered across the southern Iberian Peninsula, perhaps fewer. The bands had become small. The networks had collapsed inward to almost nothing. They lived in something approaching isolation, a final, small archipelago of humanity, holding on at the very edge of the continent that had once been entirely theirs. The modern humans, by this time, had already moved through the rest of Europe. They had spread, multiplied, established themselves. They were everywhere. They had reached the Atlantic coast of France. They had moved up into the steppes of Central Asia. They had crossed deserts and forests and rivers and mountains. They were a global species in a way that the Neanderthals had never been. But for some reason, for many thousands of years, the modern humans did not push south of the Ebro River in Iberia. There is debate about why. Perhaps the climate in that particular pocket was different. Perhaps the vegetation was different. Perhaps the Neanderthals there were strong enough, or numerous enough, or simply lucky enough to maintain a foothold that the modern humans did not quite penetrate. Whatever the reason, southern Iberia became a kind of refuge, the last refuge, the place where the old way of being human held out longest. And in that refuge, in caves like Gorham's, The last Neanderthals lived their lives. What were they like, those last ones? What did they know? What did they remember? We have to imagine this carefully because the temptation is to romanticize them, to turn them into noble savages, dying gracefully at the edge of the world. The truth was certainly more complicated. They were people. They had their conflicts and their pettiness and their small jealousies, just as any people do. They had their joys and their celebrations. They had their boring afternoons and their long nights of arguing about nothing. They lived. They were not always tragic. They were not always profound. They were, mostly, simply alive, the way every person who has ever existed has mostly been simply alive. But there must have been something else too. Some quiet awareness somewhere in the back of their minds that the world had become smaller. The grandmothers would have told the children that once, long ago, the people had been many. Once, the smoke of their fires had risen from caves all across the great northern lands. Once, there had been other bands, in valleys their grandmothers had visited as girls, valleys that were now empty. The young ones would not have believed it. The young ones never quite believed the old stories. They would have said that the grandmothers were exaggerating, that the world had always been this small, that the people had always been just these few. But the old ones knew. The old ones had seen things go away. The old ones remembered, in their bones, the larger world that had once existed. And the old ones could feel, perhaps without being able to name it, that something was coming to an end. There was a man, perhaps. Let us imagine him. Let us imagine one of the last old men, sitting outside Gorham's cave on a warm autumn evening, looking out across the Mediterranean. He has passed 60 winters now, which is almost impossibly old for his people, an age that would have once made him a legendary elder, but now simply makes him the last living person who remembers anything. He sits on a smooth, flat stone that has been polished by generations of sitting. His back hurts. His knees hurt. His eyes, once sharp enough to track a deer at half a mile, can no longer make out the small boats that move along the coast on still days, the boats of the strangers who have begun, in recent years, to appear in greater numbers along the shore. His name, in his own language, was something that we will never know. His face was creased and weathered and gentle. His hair, once dark, was now almost entirely white. His hands, once strong enough to shape the finest blades anyone in his band had ever produced, were now slow, almost trembling, almost useless. He could no longer hunt. He could barely walk to the water and back. He depended on the others for everything. But he had stories. And the children came to listen to him, in the evenings, when the work was done. He told them about his father, who had taught him how to find the right flint along the cliffs. He told them about his mother, who had known every plant in the scrubland by name. He told them about his uncle, who had once killed a wild bull with a single thrust of the spear and had walked home with the head balanced on his shoulder, smiling like a man who had won a war. He told them about his children. He had had 4. 3 were dead now. The 4th, a daughter, lived in the cave with him and had children of her own, and those children sat at his feet now, looking up at him with the wide eyes of all small children who are listening to stories that they only half understand. He told them about the cold lands, the lands where his grandfather had been born, lands that he himself had never seen, but had only heard about in the stories the old ones told when he was a boy. Lands where the mammoths walked, and the winter lasted half the year, and the snow was so deep that the houses had to be built into the ground. The children laughed. They could not imagine such a place. Snow, to them, was a rare thing that fell on the high ground in the winter and melted by afternoon. Mammoths, to them, were a word their grandfather used, not a real animal, just a sound, just a story. The old man did not correct them. He let them laugh. He understood that for them, the world he was describing had never existed. It was as foreign to them as the world of the strangers across the sea, the world they had also never seen. The two were equally distant, equally unreal, equally not a part of what they considered their lives. And he understood also something else, something that he did not say out loud, because the children were too young, and his daughter was too tired, and there was no point in saying it. He understood that, after he was gone, the stories would go too. There was no one to keep them. His daughter had heard them, yes, but she had heard them differently than he had heard them from his father. The way stories travel, generation by generation, is that they thin, they lose detail, they lose precision. By the time his grandchildren had grandchildren of their own, the stories would be only echoes. By the time those grandchildren had grandchildren, the stories would be entirely gone, and the people themselves. He understood that too. He could count the people in his band. There were, this autumn, fewer than 30. 20 winters ago, there had been more than 50. 40 winters ago, when he was a young man, there had been close to 100. The decline was not in his imagination. It was real, and he understood, without being able to say it in any language we would recognize, that something was going wrong, that something was draining away, that the people he had grown up among were not going to be replaced. He looked out at the sea. The light was beginning to turn. The water was going from blue to silver to gold, and the sky above it was deepening into something close to red. A line of seabirds passed across the sun, dark and fast. The wind picked up. He drew his cloak tighter around his shoulders. His granddaughter, the smallest one, the one with her mother's eyes, came and leaned against his knee. She did not say anything. She did not need to. He put his old, trembling hand on her head and held it there. This is what we have to imagine. This is the texture of an ending. Not a moment of horror, not a battle, not a cinematic climax. Just an old man and a child, sitting on a rock, looking at the sea, while the light fades and the wind picks up and the world, slowly, almost imperceptibly, becomes a different world. He died that winter, or the next one, or the one after that. The bones we have found from this period in the caves of southern Spain do not have names. They cannot tell us when each person died. But somewhere in those layers of dirt and ash and bone, the old man's body lies. Or someone like him. Or many like him. Old men and old women whose long lives ended in caves overlooking the sea, who had been the last keepers of stories that no one now will ever hear. Let us linger here, at the edge, for a while longer, because the moments at the edge are the ones that demand our attention. The moments at the edge are the ones that, if we look carefully, will tell us something about what it means to be human at all. Consider what it was like to be a child born into one of the last bands. To be born, perhaps, in the last 1,000 years of Neanderthal existence. To open your eyes for the first time and find yourself in a small cave on the edge of the sea, surrounded by people who carried in their faces and their bodies a particular kind of humanity that had walked the earth for 400,000 years. You would not know any of this, of course. You would not know that your people were rare. You would not know that the world had once been full of them. You would only know what every child knows: the warmth of your mother, the smell of the fire, the voice of the man who sat by the entrance and watched the path, the bright colors of the world outside the cave, when, for the first time, someone carried you out into the sun and held you up to see the sky. You would learn to walk on the polished cave floor. You would learn to speak the words your mother used. You would learn the names of the others: the aunt with the long braid, the uncle with the missing finger, the cousin with the laugh, the grandfather who could whittle small animals out of bone, the grandmother who knew the names of every plant on the hillside above the cave. You would think, as all children think, that the people around you were the way people had always been. You would think that the world you saw was the world. You would not understand, because no child understands, that you were standing at the very edge of something, that the smoke from your fire was among the last smoke that would rise from caves like yours. That the language you were learning, with such patient, eager joy, was a language that had perhaps another generation or two left in it, and then would never be spoken again. This is what makes the ending so unbearable when you sit with it. The last children did not know they were the last children. They lived their lives the way all children have always lived their lives, with questions, with games, with small jealousies and small kindnesses, with the gradual awakening to themselves as people in a world full of other people. They did not bear the weight of their species' ending. They simply lived. They simply played. They simply grew. And one day, when they were old, they would have looked around themselves and noticed that there were fewer faces, that the band was smaller, that the children, when there were children, were fewer, that the births did not always come, that the winners took more than they should. And by then, it would be too late to do anything about it. By then, the path would already be set. By then, the only question would be how many more years, how many more generations, how many more births before the end. We sometimes speak of the Neanderthals as if they were a population, as if they were a number, as if their disappearance were a matter of statistics. But it was not. It was a matter of children, of mothers, of fathers, of grandfathers and grandmothers, of the small individual lives that, taken together, are what a people actually is. Every Neanderthal who died was someone. Every Neanderthal who failed to have children was a story that did not continue. The decline was not a curve on a graph. It was a series of empty places at fires that had once been full. There is a cave in Croatia called Vindia. It is not as famous as Gorham's cave. It is not on the coast. It is inland, in the karst country, where the limestone rises in rough green hills and the rivers cut through the valleys. In Vindia, scientists have recovered Neanderthal bones that date to roughly 32,000 years ago. Among the latest known Neanderthal remains, certainly among the most carefully studied, from these bones, geneticists have been able to recover something almost miraculous. They have been able to sequence in considerable detail the genome of a Neanderthal woman who lived in that cave in that period. We do not know her name. We do not know her face. We do not know what she looked like, or how she sounded, or what she liked to eat, or whom she loved. But we know her DNA. We know, in painstaking molecular detail, the genetic instructions that built her body. We know the colors of her hair and her eyes, approximately, based on the markers in her genes. We know that she carried within her, in the long, patient code of her chromosomes, the accumulated genetic story of every Neanderthal who had ever lived before her. She is, in some sense, the most complete record we have of an entire kind of human being. And she lived in this small inland cave 32,000 years ago, in a band that was probably already very small, probably already in the long, quiet decline that would take her people to silence within a few thousand years more. When you read her genome, when you trace the variations and the mutations and the inheritance patterns, you can see things. You can see that her parents were probably distantly related, not closely, not catastrophically, but more closely related than the parents of most modern humans. This is the signature of a small population. When the band is small, when the network is small, when the people who can possibly meet each other and have children are few, the genome begins to show the closeness. The inbreeding, in the technical sense, although that word carries connotations we should be careful about. It is not a moral judgment. It is simply a mathematical reality. A small population leaves a signature in its DNA, and her DNA carries that signature. She was a child of a thinning world. And yet, when you look at her genome, when you look at every gene and every variant and every fragment of inherited information, you see that she was also fully human. There is no marker that says she was less. There is no gene that says her people were doomed. The instructions for love, for memory, for language, for art, for grief, for joy are there, the same way they are in every human being. Her genome is not the genome of a failure. It is the genome of a person. She lived, she breathed. She woke up in the morning and ate something, and worked, and slept, and woke up the next day. She did this perhaps for 30 years, or 35, or 40 before she died. She did this in a cave full of other people who loved her, who knew her name, who would have grieved when she was gone. And now her bones are in a laboratory. And her genome is in a database,
And papers have been written about her, in languages she could not have imagined, by people whose existence would have been incomprehensible to her, in a world that has been transformed beyond anything she could have ever pictured. She is, in a strange way, more known to us than to her own people. Her own people have all gone. Their memories of her, whatever they were, have been gone for tens of thousands of years. But we, the strangers, the descendants of the strangers, we can read her DNA, and we can know things about her body that even she did not know. We can know the genes she carried. We can know the diseases she was prone to. We can know the color of her hair. This is what survives: fragments, code, numbers in a database, bones in a drawer in a museum, a few teeth, a few stones, a few cave walls with the faint red lines of ancient art. And in the deeper code, in the DNA of nearly every person alive today outside of Africa, the small, whispered fragments of her people, scattered through our cells, going about their quiet work, generation after generation, unaware that they are the last echoes of a kind of humanity that the world will never see again. She is in us, but she is not us. And the difference between those two statements is the entire weight of this story. Let us turn now to a question that has haunted everyone who has ever thought deeply about the Neanderthals. What was it that we had that they did not? What was the difference in the end that allowed us to spread while they receded? This is a difficult question. It has been asked many times. Many answers have been proposed. None of them is entirely satisfying. But the discussion is worth having because it leads us into a deeper consideration not just of who they were, but of who we are. Not just of what was lost, but of what we ourselves are capable of, and at what cost. For a long time, the easy answer was that we were smarter, that our brains were more sophisticated, that we had developed some cognitive leap, some flash of insight, some inner fire that they had not. This was a comforting answer. It made our success seem deserved. It made their disappearance seem inevitable. But it does not hold up. Not really. Their brains were as large as ours. Their tool-making, when it was at its peak, was as refined as anything our ancestors were producing. Their art, when we have found it, is recognizably art. Their care for the wounded and the dead was as deep as ours. By every measure we can apply, they had the same cognitive capacities we have. So if it was not raw intelligence, what was it? One possibility is that it was social network size, that, as we have already discussed, modern humans simply lived in larger, more interconnected communities. We could share innovations across vast distances. We could trade. We could draw on the collective intelligence of many bands at once. The Neanderthals, in their smaller, more local networks, could not. So when a useful innovation occurred, it spread through us quickly and through them slowly, or not at all. Over time, the difference compounded. Another possibility is that it was reproductive strategy. We may simply have had more children, more often, with more reliable rates of survival. Modern human birth intervals appear to have been shorter than Neanderthal birth intervals. Modern human child mortality appears to have been somewhat lower. Over generations, these small differences add up to enormous gaps in population. Even with no advantage in skill or intelligence, a faster reproducing population will eventually outnumber and outspread a slower one. Another possibility, and this is perhaps the most painful one to consider, is that it was a kind of restlessness, a particular psychological orientation. The Neanderthals, by all evidence, were deeply, profoundly connected to place. They lived in particular caves for tens of thousands of years. They used the same hunting grounds for generations. They shaped their lives around the particular features of particular landscapes. They were, in some deep sense, a settled people, even though they did not have agriculture, even though they did not have permanent dwellings in any modern sense. Their relationship to place was patient, careful, almost devotional. Modern humans, by contrast, were restless. We moved. We kept moving. Our archaeological signature is one of constant motion, of long-distance travel, of materials flowing across continents. We were, from very early on, a species in motion. And the motion may not have been an advantage in any local sense.
A Neanderthal band in a familiar valley would have been better off, day to day, than a wandering modern human band that did not know the local terrain. But over the long arc of millennia, the restlessness paid off. It let us reach new places. It let us colonize spaces no Neanderthal had ever attempted to occupy. It let us survive disruptions that locked the Neanderthals to their familiar grounds. It is possible, in other words, that what saved us was not our virtue but our restlessness, our refusal to settle, our willingness to leave the known world behind and walk into the unknown one again and again, generation after generation. It is possible that what destroyed the Neanderthals was, in part, their loyalty, their attachment, their deep love of the particular places they had always known. If this is true, it casts a strange shadow over everything we have built, because the things we admire about our species, in some sense, may be byproducts of the same restlessness that doomed our cousins. The cathedrals and the cities and the long voyages of discovery and the rockets to the moon, all of them grow from the same root that allowed us to walk into Europe and slowly, without meaning to, replace the people who had already been there. We are a species that goes. We are a species that does not stop. And our refusal to stop, beautiful and terrible as it is, may have been the thing that emptied the caves of the Neanderthals. There is no moral verdict here. There is no way to say that we were right or that they were wrong. We were both kinds of human. We were both worthy. The fact that one survives and one does not mean that the surviving one is better. It only means that the surviving one is, by definition, the one who happened to survive. And evolution does not give awards for worth. It only gives awards for survival. But there is, I think, something we can learn from looking at this honestly. There is something we can take with us. The Neanderthals, whatever their disadvantages, had a depth of place, a depth of relationship to land and to each other, that we, in our modern restlessness, have largely lost. We are very good at moving. We are very good at building. We are very good at colonizing new things, new ideas, new spaces. But we are not always very good at staying. We are not always very good at the slow, careful, generational work of knowing a place so well that we become part of it, and it becomes part of us. The Neanderthals were very good at this. Better than we are. Better, perhaps, than any other people who have ever lived. And their disappearance is, among other things, a reminder of what is lost when that kind of knowledge is lost. When the people who have spent 400,000 years learning the particular shape of a particular landscape are gone, the knowledge is gone with them. The land remains, but it is no longer known in that way. It becomes, for the new occupants, a kind of unread book. They have to start from the beginning. They have to learn the language all over again. And no matter how well they learn it, they will never quite reach the depth that the previous people had reached. This is one of the gifts the Neanderthals left us, although they did not mean to give it. They left us a reminder, a warning, a demonstration of what a people who truly knew their place looked like, a demonstration of how to be, in a way that we ourselves have not been for a very long time. It is worth thinking about the next time you walk through a forest, or stand by a river, or look up at a mountain. The next time you wonder what it would have been like to belong, completely, to a particular piece of the world. They knew. They had that. They had it for longer than our entire history. And then they were gone. And we, the restless ones, the wanderers, the builders of new things, we inherited the world. We inherited the caves they had lived in. We inherited the valleys they had hunted in. We inherited even fragments of their bodies, sewn into our own DNA. But we did not inherit the way they knew that world. That, perhaps, is gone forever. Let us speak of the actual ending now, the hardest part, the part we have been dancing around. Somewhere, in some place, sometime around 30,000 years ago, perhaps a little earlier, perhaps slightly later, the last Neanderthal died. Think about that for a moment. The last one. The very last one. The end of an entire kind of human. The closing of 400,000 years of distinct existence. It must have happened somewhere. It must have happened to someone. There was, on a particular day, in a particular place, a person who was the last living member of the species, and after that person stopped breathing, there were no more. We do not know who this person was. We will probably never know. The remains we have found from the late Neanderthal period do not come with labels, and the dating techniques we use, however refined, cannot resolve the matter down to a single individual. But somewhere, in some valley, in some cave, in some last small place, a Neanderthal woman or man or child took a final breath, and the world, in that moment, lost something it would never get back. What was it like, that final breath? What was the day like? What were the circumstances? We can guess, but we will never know. Perhaps it was an old woman. Perhaps she was the last surviving member of a band that had been dwindling for decades. Perhaps the others had all died before her, one by one, in the slow attrition of a small, isolated population. Perhaps she had outlived her children and her grandchildren. Perhaps she had outlived her own band entirely and was living alone or with one or two others in a cave that had once held 30 people. Or perhaps it was not an old woman. Perhaps it was a child born to a small band whose adults could not feed her properly because the world had become too sparse. A child whose mother died in childbirth or shortly after, and who could not be raised by the few surviving women. A child who simply did not make it through the first winter, or the second, or the third. A child who slipped away in the cold, in the smoke, in the soft attention of grieving relatives who did not know that they were watching the very last of their species disappear into the dark. Or perhaps it was a young man who had gone out hunting alone because there were not enough hunters left in the band to send anyone with him, and who had been injured in some way, a fall, an attack by an animal, a bad turn of weather. A young man whose body lay where it fell, miles from any cave, and who was found by no one, who was eaten by scavengers, whose bones were scattered by the wind and the rain and the slow, patient work of time. We do not know. We cannot know. What we know is this: at some point, the last one stopped being, and after that, there were none. It is hard to fully grasp what this means. It is hard to feel it. The mind tends to slide off it. The mind wants to make it abstract, statistical, conceptual. The mind does not want to sit with the fact that an entire way of being human, an entire branch of the human family, ended in a particular moment, in a particular place, in the failing breath of a particular individual whose name we will never know. But it did. That is what happened. That is the actual texture of the ending. Not a thunderclap, not a final battle, just a body falling silent, just a chest no longer rising, just the slow cooling of a single person who was, in that moment, the only person of her kind left in the world. And then the world continued. The sun came up the next day, the seasons turned, the forests grew and the rivers flowed, and the seabirds wheeled above the rocks. The modern humans, our ancestors, went about their lives. They did not know what had happened. They could not have known. The death of one old Neanderthal woman in some unmarked cave would not have registered as a momentous event. It was just one more death in a world full of deaths. There were no news outlets, no commemorations, no funerals attended by representatives of distant lands. There was only the quiet ending of a quiet life, in a quiet place, on a quiet day. But it was not just one death. It was the death of an entire people. It was the closing of a door that had been open for 400,000 years. After that, the Neanderthals existed only in fragments, in the genes that we carry, in the bones in the caves, in the tools and the art and the burials that they left behind. But the living, breathing, thinking, feeling people, The people who had walked across the great northern plains, who had hunted mammoths and buried their dead and painted the cave walls in red. The people who had loved each other and grieved for each other and told stories around fires for hundreds of thousands of years. Those people were gone. And here is what I want to leave you with before we move toward the closing of this long meditation. I want to leave you with the smallness of it, the unremarkableness of it, the fact that this immense thing happened so quietly that nobody at the time noticed it. The fact that the end of an entire kind of human, which from our perspective seems like one of the most significant events in the history of life on this planet, was, from the perspective of the people alive at the time, simply another small disappearance, another empty cave, another fire that did not get relit. Endings in real life are usually like this. They are not announced. They are not marked. They are not given the dignity of a final scene. They simply happen in some corner of the world while everyone else is busy with their own lives. The last passenger pigeon died alone in a zoo in Cincinnati. The last thylacine died alone in a cage in Hobart. The last of many human languages have died in the mouths of single elderly speakers in villages where no one else could speak the language back to them. The endings are quiet. They are private. They are missed. The last Neanderthal, whoever she or he was, did not know that he or she was the last. There was no one to tell her. There was no signpost. There was no clear demarcation between still here and gone forever. There was only the ordinary act of a single person living and then ceasing to live, in a world that had once been full of others like her, and was now full of others who looked different and spoke a different tongue, and would, in time, fill the spaces that had been left. And so, the last Neanderthal lived her last day the way she had lived every day before it. She woke up. She felt the cold. She felt her old body, perhaps, with its old aches and its old memories. She did what she could do. She ate if there was food. She drank if there was water. She perhaps sat in the sun for a while, if the sun was out. She perhaps looked at the people around her, if there were people, or at the empty cave, if there were not. And then, at some point, in some quiet moment, she stopped. And the long story of her people ended with her, and the world went on, and the wind kept moving across the cliffs, and the sea kept coming in and going out, and no one knew that anything important had just happened. But it had. The last Neanderthal died, and the human family, which had once contained at least two distinct branches walking the earth together, now contained only one. We were alone. For the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, we were the only kind of human left, and we did not even notice. And yet, the story does not quite end there, because the bones remained, the tools remained, the caves remained, the faint marks on the walls, the scattered ornaments, the burials, the long, careful records of lives lived in the cold, green Europe of the deep past. All of it remained, hidden beneath layers of sediment, beneath layers of forest, beneath layers of pasture and farmland, and eventually, concrete and asphalt, and the slow accumulating noise of the world that came after. For tens of thousands of years, no one disturbed them. The caves filled, slowly, with the debris of subsequent occupations. Modern humans moved in. Then later, much later, agricultural peoples moved through. Then Bronze Age peoples. Then Iron Age peoples. Then the Romans and the medieval peasants and the early modern travelers. Each new layer of human activity piled on top of the old one. Each new layer of footprints obscured the older footprints beneath. The Neanderthals receded into the depths of the earth, where the air did not move and the light did not reach. They lay there, in their thousands, in their tens of thousands, in their possibly hundreds of thousands, all across Europe and into the Near East and across the steppes of Central Asia. Every body that had ever fallen and been preserved by chance, every tool that had ever been dropped and forgotten, every careful burial that had ever been made by hands that loved the body they were placing into the ground, all of it waiting, all of it sleeping, all of it surrounded by a world that, in the meantime, had transformed beyond anything they could have imagined. The languages changed, the peoples changed, the cities rose and fell, empires came and went, cathedrals were built, wars were fought. The cave at Gorum, where some of the very last of them had once watched the Mediterranean change colors in the evening light, became, over the centuries, an obscure feature on a remote piece of rock that few people visited. The cave at Vindia, where the inland holdouts had once sheltered, became a forgotten depression in a hillside. And then, slowly, one fragment at a time, the world began to find them again. It began, as we said, with that quarry worker in the Neander Valley in 1856. A skull cap, a few other bones, workers thinking it was an old cave bear. The local school teacher recognizing that the bones were strange, that they were not quite right for a modern human, that there was something in the heavy ridge above the eye sockets that did not match anything anyone had seen before. The bones traveling to scientists, the scientists arguing, some saying it was a deformed Cossack soldier who had died in the Napoleonic Wars, some saying it was an idiot, some saying it was an ancient kind of person, related to us but different, a fossil from a time before written history. The argument took decades. Other skeletons were found. The same heavy brow, the same broad nose, the same powerful build. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. There had been other people, before us, walking the same land we now walked, living and dying and burying their dead in caves that we now used for storage and stables. They had been here. They had been our predecessors. And then, they had ended. For most of the 20th century, the picture of these predecessors was unkind. The early reconstructions, the ones that filled the museum dioramas of the first half of the 20th century, made them look like ape men, stooped, hairy, brutal, dim. The word Neanderthal became a casual insult, a term of abuse, a way of calling someone primitive, stupid, uncivilized. They were the cautionary tale, the failed experiment, the dim relatives whose disappearance we did not need to mourn because, the assumption went, they had not really been worth keeping in the first place. This was, almost entirely, a projection. It was not what the bones actually said. It was what we wanted the bones to say. We wanted to believe that we, the survivors, were the deserved survivors, that our success was a matter of justice, that the Neanderthals had failed because they were inferior, and that we had succeeded because we were superior. It was a comforting narrative. It cost us nothing to believe. It took the better part of a century to begin dismantling it. New excavations, new techniques, new eyes, the discovery of more complete skeletons, the recognition of the careful burials at sites like Shanidar, the realization that the broken bones in Neanderthal skeletons showed long-term care, not abandonment. The slow accumulation of evidence that they had used pigments, made ornaments, possibly painted on cave walls. The studies of their hyoid bones and inner ears, suggesting they had been capable of complex speech. The slow turn over many decades from contempt to curiosity to respect. And then, in the last 2 decades, the great breakthrough, the sequencing of their DNA. We had not known until then that we carried them inside us. We had not known that the ancient interbreeding had left such durable traces. We had not known that every person of non-African ancestry was, in some small but real percentage, descended from these people we had spent a century mocking. The discovery, when it came, was a shock. It changed everything. It made the relationship personal. It made the relationship intimate. It made it impossible to keep them at the comfortable distance of mere cousins, mere predecessors. They were, now, family. They were inside us. They had not entirely disappeared. Part of them had become part of us. How do you mock your own ancestors? How do you laugh at the genes you carry? How do you keep calling them stupid when their cells are doing work inside your cells, right now, this very moment, helping you breathe, helping you fight off infections, helping you live? You cannot. Not really. Not honestly. And so, over the last decade or two, The popular image has slowly begun to shift. The dioramas have been redone. The Neanderthals in the new reconstructions stand upright. Their faces are gentle. They look like people because they were people. And the children who walk through the museums now see something different than what their grandparents saw. They see, instead of an ape man, an ancestor, a relative, a person, finally, recognized as a person. It is not a complete shift. There is still confusion in the public imagination. There are still cartoons. There are still casual insults. The word Neanderthal is still used to dismiss. But the dismissal is getting harder to maintain. The evidence is getting harder to ignore. The Neanderthals, dead for 30,000 years, are slowly being rehabilitated in our memory. We are giving them back, at long last, the dignity that we should never have taken from them in the first place. And this, in a strange way, is one of the gifts of the late discoveries. We have come, only in the last few decades, to begin to truly understand what we lost. We are mourning them now in some quiet and partial way that we never mourned them at the time. Not in any organized fashion, not in any official mourning, but in the slow shift of public language, in the careful museum reconstructions, in the children who look at the new dioramas and feel something stir in their chests that they cannot quite name. That stirring is real. That is a kind of memorial, a late one, a small one, but a real one nonetheless. A people who were forgotten for tens of thousands of years are, in our time, slowly being remembered, and we are doing the remembering on their behalf, because there is no one else left to do it. They cannot remember themselves. They cannot speak their own names back into the world. We have to do that for them. We have to carry the memory, however incomplete, however imperfect, of the cousins who walked beside us for so long and then went silent. What did the world lose when it lost them? This is, in some ways, an impossible question to answer, because we cannot know what we would have had with them still in it. We cannot run the experiment again. We cannot see the alternate world in which they had survived alongside us, two kinds of humans sharing the same planet, exchanging ideas and tools and stories, weaving their two lineages of culture together in ways that we now can only imagine. But we can speculate, we can imagine, we can wonder. Imagine a world today in which both species had survived, in which, alongside the modern humans who built the cities and the cathedrals, there was another kind of person, with a different brain shape, a different body shape, a different aesthetic, a different relationship to place. Imagine the conversations that would have been possible. Imagine the literatures that would have grown. Imagine the philosophies that would have emerged from a planet in which the question of what it meant to be human had a more complicated answer than it now does. We would have had to confront, every day, the fact that human was a larger category than it might have seemed. We would have had to grapple with the existence of other minds, other ways of seeing, other ways of being, embedded in bodies that were unmistakably people, even though they were not us. Our literature would be different. Our religions would be different. Our laws would be different. Our entire moral imagination would have been shaped by the daily presence of another kind of human in our world. It is possible that such a world would have been better. It is possible that we would have learned, from sharing our planet with another humanity, that the categories we draw between people are smaller and more arbitrary than we tend to think. It is possible that the racism and tribalism and exclusion that have plagued our species for so long would have been harder to maintain in a world where the most obvious other was, in fact, just another person, with all the depth and complexity that this implies. Or, it is possible that the existence of another humanity would have made things worse, that our worst impulses would have found in the Neanderthals a target to be fully unleashed, that the long history of human cruelty toward other humans, the slavery and genocide and exploitation that have been so much a part of our story, would have been amplified by the presence of a sibling species we could even more easily dehumanize. We do not know. We cannot know. The world we have is the world without them, and we have to live in it. We have to be the only kind of human now, and we have to figure out, on our own, what to make of that condition. But the fact of their absence is, I think, something we carry with us whether we know it or not. There is a kind of loneliness in being the only human species on a planet that, for most of its hominid history, had several. There is a kind of weight in being the inheritor of an empty stage. We did not choose to be alone. We did not choose to be the only ones. The other kinds of human, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, and the others whose names we are still uncovering, were taken from us by the slow attrition of evolution, by the same processes that gave us our place, processes that did not care about fairness, that did not consider what was lost. And so we walk through the world now, the only kind of human left, with the strange ghost of the others somewhere just behind us, just over our shoulders, just in the genes of our cells, just in the corners of the caves we still occasionally enter, just in the faint memory of the time when we were not alone. We are the survivors, but we are also the mourners. Or we should be. We should be the ones who remember, on their behalf, what was lost. We should be the ones who carry, in our hearts if not in our names, the knowledge that we are not the only kind of humanity that has ever existed, and that another way of being human, a way as deep and as complex and as worthy as our own, walked this same earth and is now gone. This, I think, is the deepest lesson of the Neanderthal story. Not that they were inferior, not that they were superior, but that they were. They existed. They lived complete lives in complete worlds. And the world that contained them was, by any honest measure, a richer world than the one that does not. We live in the impoverished world. We live in the world that lost them. We do not feel the loss, most days, because we have never known anything else. But the loss is real. The world we inhabit is smaller than the world they inhabited, even though we now have machines and skyscrapers and satellites, because the world they inhabited had two kinds of humanity in it, and the world we inhabit has only one. And the only one we are slowly coming to understand is fragile. We tend to think of our species as triumphant, as dominant, as permanent. We have built so much. We have spread so far. We have learned to manipulate the world around us in ways that no other creature has ever done. We seem, on the surface, to be in no danger, but the Neanderthals once seemed to be in no danger either. They had been around for 400,000 years. They had survived ice ages. They had survived climate shifts that would have wiped out lesser species. They had built a culture, a civilization in everything but the word, that had endured longer than any culture we have ever built. And then they ended. Not because of any single catastrophe, not because of any one mistake, but because the world changed, in ways too small to notice from inside a single life, and their kind of humanity, perfectly tuned for the world that no longer existed, could no longer find its place in the world that was becoming. This could happen to us. This is happening to us in some ways, even now. The world we have built, the world of cities and agriculture and global trade and electronic communication, is the world we are perfectly tuned for. But the world is changing. Again, the climate is changing. The ecosystems are changing. The very air and the very oceans are becoming different than they have been for as long as our species has existed. And we, like the Neanderthals before us, will have to adapt, or we will not survive in the form we now take. The Neanderthals could not see their own decline from inside their own lives. They could not see, from inside a single human lifetime, the slow tightening of the world around them. By the time anyone could have seen it clearly, it would have been too late to do anything about it. We have, in our own time, one advantage they did not have. We can see ourselves. We can study our own decline, if decline is coming. We can read the records of the past, including their records, and we can recognize the patterns. We can know, with much more clarity than they ever had, what is happening to us and what might happen to us. Whether we will do anything with that knowledge is another question. We have all the information we need to understand what we are. We have all the information we need to recognize our own vulnerability. We have all the information we need to act if we want to act. Whether we will act is something history will eventually tell, but it is not yet told. The Neanderthals did not have the option to choose. The world simply happened to them. They lived as well as they could, and they faded as gracefully as they could. And the fading was not their failure, but only the working out of forces too large for any single people to resist. We have, in some sense, more options than they did. We know more, we can do more, we can choose more. What we choose in the coming centuries will be the test of whether the gift we received, the gift of survival when our cousins did not survive, was a gift we deserved or merely a gift that happened to fall into our laps. I do not know the answer. No one knows the answer. The answer is in the future, and the future is being made, every day, by every choice we collectively make. But the Neanderthals are watching, in a sense. Not literally. They are dead. They have been dead for 30,000 years. But they are part of us, and part of our story, and part of the deep current of human history that flows through every one of us. They will see what we do, or they will not see because they cannot see. But the question of whether we honor or dishonor what they were, the question of whether we understand or ignore the lesson their disappearance offers, is a question we will answer with our actions in the coming generations, whether we recognize it or not. Let me take you back to a cave now. One more time. Let me take you back to the wind and the silence and the cold stone walls. Because before we end this long meditation, I want you to stand inside a Neanderthal world one last time. Not as a tourist, not as a scientist, as a witness, as someone who has come to pay respect, to acknowledge what was, to sit with the weight of what no longer is. Pick a cave, any cave. Let it be in southern France. Let it be high on a hillside above a river that has been running there for longer than any species can remember. Let it be late afternoon, in the long, slow light of a winter day, with the snow on the ground outside and the smoke rising from a small fire in the entrance. You step inside. The light dims. Your eyes adjust. The cave is not deep, but it is wide. The walls are pale gray, smooth in places where countless hands have brushed against them, rough in other places where the rock has never been touched. The floor is uneven, layered, marked by the comings and goings of generations. There is a family here. They do not see you. You are not actually there. You are only imagining this. But for the purposes of this moment, let us pretend that you can see them. A woman is grinding something on a stone near the fire. She is using a smooth oval cobble to crush dried meat and dried berries together into a kind of paste. Her hands move with a practiced rhythm. She does not look up. She has done this thousands of times. She will do it thousands of times more before her own life ends. A man sits on the other side of the fire, repairing a wooden spear. The shaft has cracked near the point. He has lashed it with sinew, carefully, again and again, building up a strong layer of binding that will hold the wood together for many more hunts. His face is intent. His hands are scarred. He works without speaking. A boy, maybe 10 years old, is sleeping on a pile of furs against the wall. He is exhausted. He has been out all day, helping the men track a small herd of deer through the snow. His face in sleep is soft. The harsh angles of the day have melted out of him. He looks, in this moment, like any boy in any age, in any place, sleeping after a long day. An old woman sits in the back of the cave, watching. She is not doing anything. She is simply watching. Her eyes are old, but they still see. She sees the woman at the fire, who is her daughter. She sees the man across from her, who is her son-in-law. She sees the boy, who is her grandson. She has known him since the day he was born. She remembers the way he smelled when he was new. She remembers the way his small hand felt in her hand when she was teaching him to walk. She is not thinking these things consciously. She is just looking. She is just there. She is just being present in the warm cave with her family on a winter afternoon, while the fire crackles and the wind moves across the entrance and the boy breathes softly in his sleep. She does not know. She cannot know. None of them can know. But this scene, or one very like it, was lived thousands of times in thousands of caves over hundreds of thousands of years. This was the pattern of their existence.
This warmth, this quiet, this presence, this family, this small ordinary moment of being together inside a small ordinary cave, while the great unknowable world moved around them in ways no single person could quite track. This was Neanderthal life. This was what we lost. Not the bones in the museum cases, not the genetic fragments in the database, not the painted lines on the wall at La Pasiega. These warm, ordinary, perfect moments of family and fire and the breathing of a sleeping child, multiplied across 100,000 fires, lived by 100 million people, for 400,000 years. All of it, every fire, every grandmother, every sleeping boy, every patient repair of every broken spear, every quiet kiss between a man and a woman who would die long before they were ever named in any of our records, every joke, every song, every meal, every gentle morning, every difficult morning, every birth, every death, every love, every loss, all of it, gone. That is what we are talking about when we talk about the Neanderthals. Not a category, not an evolutionary footnote, not a comparison point for our own success. We are talking about a vast, deep, immeasurable accumulation of lived human experience that simply ended, and that no record can fully recover, and that no imagination can fully restore. We are mourners at a grave we cannot see. We are visitors to a country that no longer exists. We are listeners trying to hear a song whose music has long since faded. But we are listening. We are trying. And in the trying, in the careful attention, in the slow, respectful work of imagining what they were, we are doing the only thing we can do for them now. We are remembering. The dead do not need remembrance for their own sake. They are dead. They are beyond needing anything. But we, the living, need to remember them. We need to remember them to know who we are. We need to remember them to understand the shape of the human story. We need to remember them to honor the long thread that connects us, through them, to the deep beginnings of what it means to be a creature with a mind, with a heart, with a fire in the night. We are made of remembering. The whole of human civilization, in some sense, is an act of remembering. Every story we tell about who we were before, every book we keep about who we have been, every museum and every monument, and every quiet personal recollection of a beloved person who is gone, all of it is the same act. It is the act of refusing to let the past be entirely lost. It is the act of saying, against the great forgetting of time, that what came before mattered, that the people who lived before us mattered, that their lives were not nothing. When we remember the Neanderthals, we are doing this. We are extending the circle of human memory backwards, beyond the recorded history of our own kind, into the deep prehistoric past where another kind of human lived and loved and died. We are saying, on their behalf, that they were here. We are saying that their lives counted. We are saying that the world has been emptied by their absence, and that the emptiness deserves to be acknowledged. This is what these long meditations are for. Not for information, not for entertainment, not for distraction in the late hours of a sleepless night. They are for the slow, careful work of letting the past back into our awareness. Letting the people who came before us be real to us, for a moment, in the way that they were real to themselves when they were alive. Letting our own world be enlarged by the recognition that it has been preceded by other worlds, other kinds of humanity, other ways of being. It is a small thing. It does not change anything practical.
The Neanderthals will not come back because we remembered them. Their caves will not refill. Their songs will not be sung again. The world they knew is gone, completely and irrevocably, and no amount of attention from us can restore it. But our attention is what we have. It is the one thing we can give them, across the unbridgeable distance of 30,000 years. We can pay attention. We can let them matter to us. We can let their existence weigh, however briefly, on our own awareness. And in doing so, we can be a kind of late echo for them, a faint sound returning from a great distance of the long-vanished sounds they once made. This is what we owe them. Not solutions, not restoration, not justice. Just attention. Just acknowledgement. Just the small, simple, profound act of recognizing that they were here, and that what they were was worthy, and that the world is smaller now that they are gone. Let me take you before we close into one more deep dive, one more long look, because there is an aspect of their existence we have not yet fully explored, and it deserves its own time. It is the question of how they thought. Not in the broad sense of whether they had thoughts, which we have already established, but in the narrower, harder, more intimate sense of what kind of thoughts they had, what kind of inner architecture, what kind of mental landscape, what it was like in the deep privacy of a Neanderthal mind to be alive. We cannot know, of course. We can never know. The only access we have to another mind is the access provided by language. And the Neanderthal language is gone. And even if we had it, the gap between knowing the words of a mind and knowing the mind itself is enormous. We do not really know what is happening inside the minds of the people who live next to us, the people who share our beds, the people we have known our entire lives. We are constantly guessing. We are constantly inferring. We are constantly mistaken. So when we ask what was happening inside a Neanderthal mind, we are reaching across an enormous gap with very limited tools. But we can still reach. We can use what evidence we have. We can think carefully about what their brain anatomy might have implied. We can consider what their behaviors suggest. We can imagine, with care and humility, the kind of inner life that might have given rise to the outer signs we can still see. Their brains, as we have noted, were as large as ours, in many cases slightly larger, but size is not the same as architecture. The shape of their brains, as far as we can reconstruct it from the inner surfaces of their skulls, was slightly different. Their brains were a bit longer, a bit lower, a bit less rounded than the brains of modern humans. The occipital region, at the back, was larger in proportion. This is the region most associated with visual processing. Their visual systems may have been more developed than ours. They may have seen the world, in some sense, with more visual detail than we do. What does this mean? It is hard to say, but it is interesting to think about. A Neanderthal walking through a forest may have noticed things that a modern human would have missed. Patterns in the bark of trees, subtle differences in the postures of distant animals, small movements at the edges of vision. The visual world may have been for them a more saturated and more detailed thing than it is for us. They may have lived in a slightly more visually immediate environment than we do, because their brains were better tuned to take it in. This would fit with what we know about how they lived. As close-quarters hunters of large, dangerous animals, as people who had to read the land in fine detail to find the resources they needed, as crafters of refined stone tools that required the careful inspection of raw material, they would have benefited from heightened visual processing. They would have been, perhaps, beautifully tuned to see. But other regions of their brains, relative to ours, may have been less developed. The frontal lobes, where some of the most complex executive functions of the modern human mind take place, may have been proportionally smaller in their case. This does not mean they could not plan, or that they could not think abstractly, or that they could not consider the future. They clearly could. But it does suggest that the balance of their cognition may have been different than the balance of ours. They may have been more anchored in the immediate sensory present, less prone to long flights of abstract speculation, more focused on the rich and detailed here and now. We do not know. We cannot know. But it is suggestive. It hints at a kind of mind that may have been profoundly attentive to the surrounding world, profoundly anchored in the particularities of place and moment, profoundly capable of taking in what was actually there, in front of them, in the cave or the forest or on the snowy ridge. We modern humans are, by comparison, restless minds. We are always somewhere else. We are always anticipating, planning, remembering, projecting. We are rarely fully present in the moment in front of us. Our minds are constantly off in other places. We are thinking about tomorrow, about yesterday, about people who are not in the room, about scenarios that have not happened and may never happen. This is, in some ways, our great gift.
It is what allowed us to plan complex hunts, to develop agriculture, to build empires. But it is also our great burden. It is what makes us, so often, miserable in the middle of what should be peaceful moments. The Neanderthals may have lived more inside their lives than we live inside ours. They may have been more able to simply be there, in the cave, with the firelight on the walls, with the family around them, without the constant background hum of anxiety and projection that fills the modern mind. This is speculation. It is romantic speculation, but it is rooted in real differences in brain architecture, and it is worth considering. If it is even partly true, it adds another layer to the sorrow of their disappearance. We did not just lose another kind of body. We did not just lose another kind of culture. We may have lost another kind of inner experience, another way of being conscious, another texture of awareness, a way of being human that was, perhaps, in some ways, more present than ours, more rooted, more inhabited. Imagine, for a moment, what it would be like to spend a day inside such a mind, to wake up in the cave, to feel the cold air without naming it, to smell the smoke without thinking about it, to see the firelight on the wall without analyzing it, to hear your child's breathing without worrying about her future, to simply be there, fully there, with your senses wide open to what was, without the constant inner chatter that fills the modern human head. It would be a kind of waking meditation, a kind of presence that the spiritual traditions of our own species have spent thousands of years trying to recover, through prayer and meditation and ritual, with limited success. The Neanderthals may have had it as a birthright, as a feature of how their minds were built. They may have lived, in some sense, in the state that our wisdom traditions consider the highest achievement of a human mind, and they may have done it without effort, without practice, simply as a function of who they were. I am not saying that they were enlightened. I am not saying that their lives were free of suffering. They were not. They were people. They suffered. They feared. They felt pain. They felt loss. They were not somehow elevated above the human condition. They were inside it, just as we are inside it. But the particular shape of their consciousness, the particular way the inside felt to them, may have had qualities that we ourselves have largely lost, and that we can only approach, when we approach them at all, through deliberate effort. This is another thing we may have lost when we lost them. Not just a body, not just a culture, a way of being aware, a way of inhabiting the present moment, a way of belonging to the world. It is a haunting thought. It is a thought that I have sat with for a long time while writing these words. And it is a thought I want to offer to you now, not as a conclusion, but as something to carry with you, something to consider, something to hold up against your own moment-to-moment experience and ask, quietly, whether something has been lost in the way you live, whether the restless, busy mind that fills your modern human head is the only kind of human mind there has ever been, whether there might once have been other minds, equally human, that were quieter, more present, more at home in the body and the senses and the immediate world. There were such minds. They walked the earth for 400,000 years. They were the minds of our cousins, and they are gone. We do not have to mourn this in any dramatic way. We do not have to wear black
or carry flowers, or stage rituals. We only have to know it. We only have to let it be real to us. We only have to acknowledge, in the quiet of our own thinking, that there were other ways of being human besides the way we are human, and that the disappearance of those other ways diminished the human story. And then, having acknowledged it, we go on with our lives. We do what we have to do. We work, we love, we raise children, we make art, we make mistakes, we try to be good people. We try to do less harm than we do good. We try, in our limited, distracted, modern way, to be present in our own lives. And maybe, sometimes, in the quietest moments, when the day has wound down and the fire is low and the people we love are sleeping nearby, we can let ourselves be a little more like them, a little more present, a little more rooted, a little more here. That, too, would be a kind of memorial.
A late one, an invisible one, but a real one.
A way of carrying them with us, in the texture of our own awareness, by allowing ourselves, occasionally, to slow down and notice what is in front of us, with the same kind of patient, generous attention they may have brought, naturally, to the small, ordinary cave at the end of a long winter day. Let us speak now of one more thing. Let us speak of what they may have known about death, about their own mortality, about the meaning in their inner world of the end of a single human life. We have already noted the burials. We have already noted the careful arrangement of bodies, the placing of objects, the apparent reverence. We have already noted the love that survives in the bones, the long care of the wounded, the keeping alive of the broken. But there is more. There is the question of what they understood about death itself. Did they grasp, in any conceptual sense, that all of them would die? Did they have, in their inner architecture, anything like the modern human awareness of mortality? It is hard to imagine that they did not. Their brains were complex enough. Their lives were intimate enough. Their experiences with the death of others were frequent enough. They must have known. They must have understood at some level that the people they buried were not coming back, that the bodies they placed in the earth were not going to rise again, here at least, in this life. They must have understood, when they themselves grew old, that they too would one day fall silent, that they too would one day be placed in the earth, or have their bodies left in the cold, or simply disappear from the band that had been their home. How did they handle this knowledge? What did they make of it? What stories did they tell themselves around their evening fires about where the dead had gone? What did the grandmother say to the children who asked, as all children ask, what had happened to the uncle who was no longer here, or the cousin who had not come back from the hunt? We do not know. We will never know. But we can be sure that they had stories, some kind of stories, because every people who has ever existed has had stories about death. It is one of the universal features of human consciousness. When confronted with the death of a loved one, we make narratives, we construct meanings, we imagine in some form where they have gone, what they have become, whether they can hear us, whether we will see them again. The Neanderthals, with their human-sized brains and their human-sized hearts, and their long, deep history of burial and care, almost certainly did this. They had stories about death. They had beliefs, of some kind. Perhaps they thought the dead became spirits in the wind. Perhaps they thought the dead went into the earth and waited there for some renewal. Perhaps they thought the dead became the animals, the deer, the bears, the wolves whose lives moved alongside their own. Perhaps they thought the dead went into the sky, into the stars that wheeled above the cave on the cold, clear winter nights. We do not know what they believed, but they believed something. And whatever they believed shaped how they grieved, how they buried, how they remembered. It shaped how they lived in the long shadow of knowing that they would not always be here. It shaped, in some quiet but real way, what it felt like to be a Neanderthal at all. There is one site in particular that pulls at the imagination here. There is a cave in Spain called El Cedrón, where the bones of an entire family have been found, all dating to roughly 49,000 years ago. A group of about a dozen individuals, men, women, and children of varying ages. Their bones were jumbled together in a way that suggests they all died around the same time. There are signs of cannibalism, which has prompted long debate about what happened to them. Some researchers think they may have been killed and eaten by a different band. Others think they may have starved together and that the survivors performed some sort of mortuary cannibalism on the dead before themselves dying. Whatever happened, what we have is a snapshot of a single Neanderthal family, frozen in the moment of its ending. A grandmother, parents, several children, cousins perhaps, all of them gone at the same time, in the same place, in the same disaster. When you stand in the cave at El Cedrón or look at the photographs of the bones laid out as they were found, you cannot help but feel something. These were people who had loved each other. These were people who had lived in some small cave or shelter or rock overhang together, who had shared their fires, who had told each other stories. The children had played in the same dust. The adults had carried the same worries. The grandmother had watched her grandchildren grow up the way grandmothers watched their grandchildren grow up. And then something happened, and they were all gone, together, in one terrible event whose details we cannot now recover. This is the texture of their reality, not abstract patterns, not statistical curves. Family. The accidents and disasters and slow attritions that take families apart. The same forces that have always taken families apart, in every human culture, in every age, since the first human family there ever was. They are not so different from us in this. We too lose our families. We too watch the people we love die, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, sometimes in ways that we will never quite understand. We too are confronted, again and again across our lives, with the unbearable fact of human mortality. We too have to find some way to keep going after the people we cannot imagine living without are gone. They did it. We do it. It is, perhaps, the most fundamental of all human tasks. Older than language, older than fire, older than the species itself. The task of continuing to live in the face of death. The Neanderthals were good at it. They did it for 400,000 years. They kept going. They kept burying their dead and raising their children and shaping their stones and lighting their fires, even as each generation was lost to time, even as each loved one slipped away, even as the cold and the hunger and the accidents took their slow, steady toll. And then, eventually, they stopped doing it. Not because they failed at the task, but because the task ran out. There were no more of them to do it. The long, patient work of continuing was finally given over to other hands, other peoples, other minds. The continuing of the human story did not stop. It only passed, fully, from one branch of the family to another. We are doing the continuing now. We are the ones who are still here. We are the ones who are still burying our dead and raising our children and shaping our stones and lighting our fires. We are, in some sense, doing the task that they did, in the same world, in the same way, just with different bodies and different languages and different tools. It is a strange relay. It is a kind of inheritance we did not choose to receive, but we have received it, and so we have a responsibility, in some quiet and intangible way, to do well by it, to honor the long line of beings who carried the torch of human continuity before us, to not let the torch fall during our own watch, to pass it forward, when our time comes, to whoever will carry it next. This is what they would want us to do, if they could speak to us. I think it is. I cannot prove it, but I think it is. They would want us to continue. They would want us to do the things they did, to keep the fire burning, to care for our wounded, to bury our dead with attention, to paint on the walls, to tell stories around the evening fires, to love the people we love, while they are here to be loved. These are simple things. They are not the things our civilization talks about most loudly. We talk about progress. We talk about success. We talk about innovation. We talk about all the things our restless minds can imagine. But underneath all of it, the deeper task, the older task, the task we share with the Neanderthals and with every other people who has ever existed, is the simple human task of being together, of caring for each other, of marking the passages of our lives with attention, of doing the small daily work of continuing. That is the Neanderthal legacy. That is what they did for 400,000 years. That is the deep template they have left behind, written into the bones and the burials and the painted lines on the walls of the deep caves of Europe. It is a template we are still working from, whether we recognize it or not. It is a template that is older than any of our religions, older than any of our philosophies, older than any of our nations. It is the original template of what it means to be a person with other persons in a world that does not promise us anything beyond the immediate work of getting through one more day with the people we love. The Neanderthals knew this. They lived it. For 400,000 years they lived it. And in the end, when the world had turned and their kind could no longer find its place, they handed the template forward to us in the form of the burials and the paintings and the genes in our cells, and they trusted us in some unspoken way to keep doing what they had been doing. We have done it, more or less. We have continued. The fires have not gone out. But we should remember, when we sit by our own fires, in our own homes, in our own evenings, that the fire we are sitting by is part of a much longer fire. A fire that was lit, in some sense, by our cousins, long before our own kind ever stepped into Europe. A fire that has been kept burning, generation after generation, by every human who has ever rebuilt it after it has gone low. We are not the first. We are only the latest. And the fire we are tending was tended, before us, by people whose bones are buried beneath the earth we walk on, and whose hands shaped some of the first deliberate flames that ever burned in this part of the world. It is their fire too. It will always be their fire too, as long as it keeps burning. There is something else I want to give you before we close, something I have been holding back. A way of seeing them that might help, that might offer some comfort, that might soften the long sorrow of contemplating their disappearance. It is this. They did not, in the end, fail. They were not a mistake. They were not a wrong turn that the human story made before correcting itself with our own arrival. They were a complete and valid expression of what it means to be a person. They lived their lives fully, for as long as they were able to live them. And the fact that they ended is no different, in essence, from the fact that any single human ends. Every individual life ends. Every people ends. Every species ends. The ending is built into the gift of being alive at all. The ending does not erase the value of the life. When you mourn a person who has died, you do not, generally, conclude that their life was a failure because they died. You do not look at a beloved grandmother in her coffin and decide that her existence was a mistake. You understand, instead, that her life was a complete thing, with its own shape, its own arc, its own meaning, and that the ending of it, sad as it is the natural completion of the gift of having been alive at all. The Neanderthals were a complete thing in this same sense. They had a beginning, a long middle, and an end. The end does not undo the middle. The end does not retroactively invalidate the millions of small good days they lived. The end is simply the end. It is what happens to every living thing, given enough time. It is what will happen, eventually, to us, and to our descendants, and to every species that has ever lived or will ever live. What matters is what is done with the middle. What matters is the texture of the life while it is being lived. What matters is the warmth of the fire, the love between the people, the careful attention to the small details of being alive in a particular place and a particular time. The Neanderthals had all of this. They had it in abundance. They had it for longer than we have had it. They had it richly and deeply and well. If their story had to end, and every story has to end, it ended having been a complete story. It ended having been worth telling. It ended having been a chapter of human existence that, while it lasted, was a real and valid and beautiful thing. This is, I think, the most important thing to carry with you after sitting with their disappearance for as long as we have sat with it. Not sadness, not regret, not the cheap sentimentality of mourning a thing that cannot be brought back. Something deeper and quieter, a kind of respect. A recognition that they were here, and that what they were was good, and that the goodness of what they were is not undone by the fact that they are no longer here. We can carry them with us this way, not as a tragedy, not as a cautionary tale, not as evidence of anything we did right or wrong, as a presence, as an extended family, as distant relatives whose lives mattered, whose existence enriched the world, and whose memory we are privileged to keep alive in whatever way we can. When you are out walking in a forest, sometime, when the light is slanting through the trees in that particular way it does in the late afternoon of a winter day, when the air is cold and the smell of earth is in your nose, and the silence is enormous, you might think of them, not in any prolonged way, not as some heavy meditation, just for a moment, just for the length of a single breath. There were people here once, people who knew this forest, or one like it, better than any modern person knows anywhere. People who walked these paths, or paths like them, with the careful attention of those who depended on the forest for everything they had. People whose breath also rose in the cold air, whose feet also pressed into the snow, whose eyes also scanned the spaces between the trees for the dark shapes of animals. You are walking, in some sense, in their footsteps. The footsteps are no longer visible. The snow has erased them long ago, and the snow that came after, and the snow that came after that. But the path is there in some deeper sense. The shape of the walking is there. The pattern of how a human moves through a forest is there, has always been there, will always be there as long as humans walk through forests. You can feel it sometimes if you let yourself, the deep echo of all the human walks that came before yours. The deep echo of all the human watchers who watched the same kinds of light come through the same kinds of trees. The deep continuity that runs underneath all of our individual lives and connects us in some quiet way to every human who has ever been. The Neanderthals are in that continuity. They are part of it. They are not separated from it by their disappearance. They are still in the deep current of what it has meant for hundreds of thousands of years to be a thinking, feeling, walking creature on this planet. You can let them be there. You can let them be present in some small and quiet way in your own awareness of the natural world. You can let them be ancestors, even if not directly, even if only as cousins or near cousins, or members of the larger family of beings who have shared the experience of being human on this earth. This is, perhaps, the only afterlife that any of us truly have. The afterlife of being remembered. The afterlife of being held in the awareness of the people who come after us. The afterlife of mattering, in some small way, to someone who has heard our story. The Neanderthals have this afterlife. They have it because, in the last few decades, we have begun to remember them properly, to give them back their dignity, to recognize what they were. They have this afterlife because, right now, in the very moment of these words, you are thinking of them. You are letting them be real to you. You are holding their existence in your mind, for a little while, in a way that they were not held for tens of thousands of years. This is not nothing. This is, in some sense, everything. This is the thing that, more than any monument or any scientific paper or any museum exhibit, keeps them present in the human story. This is the thing that ensures they are not entirely lost. So thank you, in a strange way, for spending this time with them. Thank you for letting them be real to you, for these hours of listening. Thank you for being part of the late, slow, ongoing work of remembering them. They cannot thank you themselves. They are not here. But on their behalf, if such a thing can be done across 30,000 years and across the gap between species, I want to say it. Thank you for paying attention. Attention is the rarest gift we have. It is the gift we offer, in small ways, to everyone we truly love, to the children we listen to the parents we sit with, to the friends we let into our lives, to the strangers whose stories briefly cross our own. Attention is what makes us real to each other. It is what makes the world real to us. When you give attention to the Neanderthals, you are doing the same thing. You are letting them be real to you. You are letting their existence matter to your own awareness. You are extending, in a small but meaningful way, the circle of who counts as your fellow human beings, who counts as part of your extended family, who counts as a person whose life and death deserves your notice. This is what we have. This is, in some sense, all we have. The capacity for attention, the capacity for care, the capacity to let the past be present to us in our minds, in our hearts, in the long, quiet work of imagining what it must have been like to be a person we never met. The Neanderthals deserve this from us. They have not always gotten it. They were treated, for most of the time we have known about them, with a casual cruelty that does us no credit. We mocked them. We made cartoons of them. We turned their name into an insult. We did not see them clearly. But we are seeing them more clearly now. And in the seeing, we are doing them, however late, a small justice. We are giving them, at last, the regard they were always owed. The regard that any people, any kind of human, anywhere in the great story of our species is owed, simply for having existed. This is enough. This is, in the end, what we can offer. And as the wind moves in and out of the cave at the edge of the Mediterranean, as the sea continues its long, slow conversation with the rocks of Gibraltar, as the bones of the last Neanderthals lie in the soil of southern Europe and Central Asia and the cold north of the Great Plains, we can let them rest, finally, in the awareness that they are not entirely forgotten, that, in our time, they have been remembered, that, in our time, they have been given back something of the dignity they were always owed. The wind blows on. The sea continues. The world turns slowly through its own long, slow, patient endings and beginnings. And somewhere, in some quiet corner of the great current of human attention, the Neanderthals are still being thought of, still being noticed, still being acknowledged. For tonight, that is enough. For tonight, we let them rest. There is a moment near the end of any long meditation when the words begin to thin, when the things you wanted to say have largely been said, when the ideas have unfolded as far as they will unfold, when the only remaining task is to stop and to do so gracefully and to let the silence return. We are reaching that moment now. I have told you, in the language we have, what we know and what we can guess about the last of the Neanderthals. I have tried to give you their world, not as a textbook, but as a place. I have tried to let you stand in their caves, sit by their fires, watch the firelight on the faces of people whose names we will never know. I have tried to take you to the edge of their disappearance, to the long, quiet decline, to the final, unknown moment when the last of them stopped breathing, somewhere in the cold, green west of the world. I have not told you everything. There is more, always. There are bones we have not yet found. There are caves we have not yet explored. There are genetic discoveries that will come in the years ahead that will refine and complicate everything we now think we know. The science of the Neanderthals is not a closed field. It is, in some ways, just beginning. Every decade brings new revelations. Every excavation brings new fragments. The story is still being assembled, even now. But the broad shape of it is clear enough. They were a people. They lived for a long time. They were our cousins, our near relatives, our last surviving siblings in the family of humankinds. They were not failures. They were not less than us. They were just themselves. And then, in a long, quiet process whose details we will never fully recover, they faded from the world, and we were left as the only ones. This is the story. The bones say it, the genes say it, the caves say it, the art says it. The careful burials, the bones of the wounded and the old, the small artifacts of decoration and meaning, all of it says it. They were here, and they were people, and they are gone. What we do with this knowledge is up to us. Most days we will do nothing with it. We have our own lives. We have our own concerns. We cannot carry in every waking moment the awareness of every kind of being that has ever existed and disappeared. We are not built for that. We would not be able to function. But sometimes, in quiet moments, in the late hours, in the long pauses of a long evening, we can let them in. We can let them be real to us for a little while. We can let their existence reach across the gap of 30,000 years and touch our own existence, briefly, gently, the way the touch of a long-dead grandmother might come to a grandchild who never met her, but who carries her blood and her shape and her quiet inheritance through every day of an unrelated life. We are their inheritors, whether we know it or not, whether we choose to be or not. We carry them. They are in us, in our cells, in our story, in the very landscape we walk through, which they shaped and named and made human long before our own ancestors arrived. They are part of the deep ground on which we stand, even now, even when we are not thinking of them. So let us, before we end, take a moment of silence, not literally, not a pause in the words, but a kind of inner silence, a holding still, a letting be. Let us imagine them, one last time. A small group of people in a cave at the edge of the sea. The fire is burning low. Outside, the wind is moving across the cliffs. The waves are sounding, slowly, on the rocks below. The light is fading. The day is ending. A man sits near the entrance, watching the sea. His face is calm. His hands are still. He has done his work for the day, and now he is at rest. His eyes are on the water. He is not thinking of anything in particular. He is just there, with the sea, with the dying light, with the wind moving the loose ends of his hair against his cheek. A woman is inside, near the fire. She is feeding it the last small pieces of wood from the day's gathering. The flames take the wood and rise gently. The shadows shift across the walls. A child sleeps, a small girl. Her hand is curled near her face. She is dreaming. Her breath is slow. Her dreams are her own. We do not know what they are. We will never know what they are. An old woman sits in the back. She is watching all of it. The man at the entrance, the woman at the fire, the sleeping child. She has lived a long life. She has seen many things. She has lost many people. She is, in this moment, at peace. The cave is quiet. The fire crackles. The wind moves. The sea sounds. The world turns. This is the last evening. We do not know which one is the last. We do not know which person is the last. But somewhere, in some cave like this one, this scene is unfolding, for the very last time in the history of their species. And no one in the scene knows it. They are simply being. They are simply alive. They are simply doing what humans have always done, what humans will always do, what humans will continue to do for as long as there are humans on this earth at all. The fire goes down a little more. The man at the entrance pulls his cloak around his shoulders. The woman at the fire turns to check on the child, who is still sleeping. The old woman closes her eyes for a moment. opens them again, looks at the cave wall opposite her, where the firelight is dancing in patterns that she has seen, in some form, every evening of her long life. The light fades. The fire burns lower. The night comes. And after the night, in some quiet way that no one notices, the long story of the Neanderthals ends. The wind keeps blowing. The sea keeps sounding. The world keeps turning. The other humans, the strangers from the south, move through their own lives in their own caves, in their own valleys, unaware that anything has changed. The cave grows cold. The fire goes out. No one comes back. This is the ending. It is small. It is quiet. It is utterly without drama. It is, in its smallness and its quietness, the most honest ending the story could have. Because this is how things actually end, most of the time, in the real world. They do not end with battles. They do not end with announcements. They do not end with anyone declaring that the end has come. They simply end. The fire goes down. The wind blows on. The light fades. And after a while, someone wakes up in a different cave, in a different valley. And the world goes on without the people who used to be in the world before. We are the descendants of the people who woke up. We are the children of the ones who went on. We have inherited everything that came after, and we have, alongside it, a quiet shadow, a missing presence, a great accumulated absence in the corner of the human story, where our cousins should have been. The absence is, in its own way, beautiful. It teaches us. It reminds us. It tells us, in the deepest possible terms, what it means to be a finite kind of being in a vast and indifferent world. We are finite. They were finite. Everything that has ever lived has been finite. The world has been built and will continue to be built by finite creatures whose time runs out and whose stories end and whose names are forgotten and whose ashes blow away on the wind. But while we are here, we are here. While they were here, they were here. The being here is the gift. The being here is everything. And so I leave you with this. The fire is dying. The light is fading. The wind is moving across the cliffs. The sea is doing what the sea has always done. Somewhere, in some cave that no one will ever find, the last of them is finishing the last of their days. And then, very gently, very quietly, the long old story finishes its last sentence. Sleep well, last people of the deep past. Sleep well, keepers of the long fire. Sleep well, in the quiet earth that has held you for 30,000 years. We remember you, as well as we are able. We remember you, and we will keep remembering you, for as long as we ourselves remain here, in the world you walked first, in the world you loved as well as you knew how, in the world that is still, in some quiet way, your world too. Good night, cousins. Good night. The wind moves on across the empty hillsides. The sea folds in upon itself, again and again, in the rhythm it has kept for longer than any species has lived. The stars come out, slowly, one by one, above the dark line of the cliffs, and the long story of our family, with one of its longest threads now finished, goes on and on and on, into whatever comes next, carried by the ones still here, whoever they may be, wherever they may be, in whatever quiet caves of their own they have made themselves at home. The fire is out, the night is full, the story rests.